Hi guys, and welcome to the Gentle History Podcast. Tonight you arrive just a little too late. A thin layer of ash drifts slowly through the air, settling softly on your shoulders, light as snow but warmer than it should be. You brush it away without thinking, only to notice how quiet everything is. No footsteps, no distant voices, not even the sound of wind. Just a stillness that feels unnatural. You take a slow breath, and there is a faint bitter taste in the air. It lingers longer than expected. You pause. Because something here does not quite make sense, and the more you notice, the clearer it becomes. If you were truly standing here, you would not have time to understand it. You probably would not survive this. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And don't forget to share your location and local time in the comments. I always enjoy seeing where in the world you're listening from. Now dim the lights, flow straight into the story. You do not stay in that strange ash-filled silence for long. The image fades as gently as breath on glass, and in its place comes another kind of stillness, one that is less dramatic and somehow more serious. Evening on the Oregon Trail. No orchestra. No heroic sunset worth framing over a fireplace. Just a pale sky draining of colour, a hard plain going grey, and a line of wagons settling in for the night with all the glamour of a moving shed yard. You're tired in the deep, practical way that seems to start in your feet and work upward. All day the trail has rubbed dust into your clothes and jolted your bones with every rut and stone. Now at last the wheels stop. The oxen lower their heads. Someone calls out to unhitch. Someone else coughs into a sleeve. A child begins to whimper, not because anything terrible has happened, but because everything has happened all day, and now there is no energy left to bear it politely. This is what many travellers on the Oregon Trail knew very well by the 1840s and 50s. Most emigrant wagons were not giant rolling houses, no matter what later films would like you to believe. They were usually ordinary farm wagons fitted with curved bows and a canvas cover built to carry goods more than people. That is the mainstream truth of it. And it matters because when night comes, you are not stepping into a cosy wooden cabin on wheels. You're crawling into a drafty storage box with ambitions. The camp gathers itself in small motions. Iron pots come down. Coils of rope are tossed aside. A woman shakes out a blanket that already looks exhausted. A man kneels by the wagon wheel and checks a pin with the solemnity of a priest handling relics. You stand there for a moment in the failing light and feel the cold beginning to collect. Not yet dramatic, not yet cruel, just present. It touches your ears first, then your fingertips, then the narrow place between your neck and collar, where every bad decision seems to arrive early. The smell of supper rises, if that noble word can be used for salt pork coffee, and something that has resigned itself to being called stew. Smoke drifts low and reluctant. It carries a sweetness from the wood, a bitter edge from grease, and the earthy scent of trampled grass under too many boots. You hear tin cups knock together. You hear one of the oxen breathe out through its nose long and damp. Somewhere farther off, a dog gives a single bark, then thinks better of it. You're not alone, of course, and that may be the oddest comfort. Around you are families, hired hands, widows, newly married couples, teenagers, pretending not to be frightened, and children who have accepted rough living with the baffling speed of the very young. Thousands of emigrants travelled west in great waves during the peak decades of the trail. Some estimates suggest that by the middle of the 19th century, hundreds of thousands had gone toward Oregon, California, or Utah by overland routes. Numbers like that can sound grand and sweeping. Out here, though, it narrows to one baby fussing, one kettle, steaming one pair of hands too stiff to tie a knot neatly. A curious little tidbit survives from trail lore as well. Some travellers spoke of placing heated stones near bedding when they could spare the fuel, and had not already used the stones for cooking. It sounds wonderfully sensible, until you remember that a badly wrapped hot stone in a wagon full of cloth straw and weary people is less a comfort than an adventure in poor planning. Frontier life does love a practical idea balanced delicately on the edge of disaster. You help where you can. That is what you do out here. Sitting uselessly would feel worse than working. You pass a sack, you steady a lantern, you lift a small bundle that turns out to contain nearly everything a family has not already broken, traded, or lost. The wagon beside yours holds tools, bedding, flour, coffee, clothing, and a rocking chair someone absolutely insisted on bringing across half a continent. Human beings do have a gift for optimism. Historians still argue whether most emigrants imagined the journey with clear eyes before leaving, or whether hope simply edited out the uglier parts until the trail corrected them. As the last of the light thins away, the world grows flatter and larger at once. The prairie has that trick. In daylight it looks open. At dusk it looks endless. There is no wall to hold the warmth, no thick roof to keep back the sky. The covered wagon suddenly seems tiny, less a shelter than a suggestion. You look at it and try to picture sleep inside. Real sleep. The kind where your body forgets itself. Already that feels ambitious. The cold sharpens. It reaches your knees through the cloth of your trousers. It stiffens the damp edge of a handkerchief in your pocket. Your breath is visible now, a faint ribbon drifting and fading. Someone laughs nearby at a joke too tired to travel far. It is the sort of laugh people produce when they would quite like to complain, but manners are cheaper than mutiny. Then comes that quiet frontier arithmetic. How many blankets? How many bodies? How much dry ground? Whether the children sleep inside the wagon or beneath it. Whether the sick person gets the thicker quilt. Whether the canvas is tied tight enough. Whether the firewood should be saved for morning. Every answer means some other comfort is lost. You begin to understand that a freezing night on the trail does not arrive all at once. It is built piece by piece by small shortages. You eat while the food is hot, which is to say, you eat quickly. The tin spoon tastes metallic and cold at the edges. The stew is thin, salty, and marvellous because it is warm. Coffee follows dark and smoky, carrying more comfort than flavour. Around the campfires, faces glow and vanish, glow and vanish. You catch bits of conversation. A creek crossed badly 2 days ago. A lame mule. A cousin in Missouri. A rumour of early frost. Someone claims a guidebook promised easier ground ahead, which earns a sound from the group that is not quite laughter and not quite prayer. The sky deepens. Stars prick through. There are so many of them that for a moment you nearly forget yourself. Nearly. Then the wind shifts. It slips under your collar and down your back with icy fingers, and your whole body tightens in answer. There it is, the real beginning. Night is no longer approaching. Night has arrived, and it wants very little from you except endurance. You turn toward the wagon. The canvas cover pale in the dim light stirs faintly. Wooden wheels stand dark and still. Underneath waits your bed, if that generous term can survive the facts. You know already that the boards will be hard, the air close, and the cold somehow both muffled and sharpened by the cloth overhead. You know sleep will come in scraps. You know you will wake often. You know morning is far away. And yet you climb toward it because everyone does. Because there is nowhere else to go. Because tomorrow the wagon must move again. And tonight, whether you like it or not, this creaking box is home. You put one hand on the wagon from and feel how the wood has already lost the day's last warmth. It is not just cool. It has crossed into that unpleasant frontier category of cold that seems almost personal. Around you camp is still moving, but more slowly now, as if everyone has entered the final careful stage of evening, when every decision matters more because correcting it in the dark will be annoying beyond all proportion. The wagon itself stands where it stopped, but that does not mean the place was chosen carelessly. Camping ground on the Oregon Trail is a small science mixed with luck fatigue and the hopeful belief that this patch of earth will be less terrible than the previous one. You look around and begin to notice what people notice when they have spent enough nights outdoors to become suspicious of harmless-looking grass. You do not want low ground if you can help it. Cold air settles there, sinking into hollows and shallow dips with the same stubborn logic as water. A patch that seems sheltered in daylight can become a bowl for night frost. You also do not want ground too near marshy edges because damp cold is a sly kind of misery. Dry cold bites. Damp cold negotiates its way into blankets, boots and bones, until you wonder whether your whole body has turned into a sponge for discomfort. So the wagons are drawn up with care. Some emigrant groups circle them from habit or caution, though not every camp forms the neat dramatic ring later legends adore. Often the wagons are arranged simply according to terrain grazing needs, water access, and the temper of people who are too tired to produce a perfect geometric symbol of frontier unity. That is one of those useful historical truths. The famous wagon circle was real but not universal. Many camps were far more practical looking than theatrical, which is probably just as well because theatre offers very poor wind protection. You watch a man pace off distance from a little rise to the creek, then shake his head and call for the wagon behind him to stop farther back. Another family chooses the lee side of a slight bank, grateful for anything that may break the wind. A woman kneels and presses her hand into the grass, checking whether the ground is already carrying evening damp. Nearby, someone mutters that a pretty campsite is never to be trusted. It is the sort of advice that sounds folksy until you realise it was purchased with previous bad nights. You help guide the team a little farther, boots scraping over earth gone crisp with cold. The oxen snort and toss their heads in protest. They have carried enough today, thank you very much. Their smell comes up warm and animal in the fading light, a dense mixture of hide, mud and slow breathing. It is strangely reassuring. A camp with livestock still shifting and huffing feels alive. You would rather hear that than silence. The wind matters too. It slides over the plain in long, shallow currents, and even a weak breeze can make the difference between discomfort and a private spiritual crisis conducted under canvas. People angle wagons, stack goods, and sometimes hang extra cloth to cut the draft. It is not elegance, it is improvisation. On the trail, elegance usually goes overboard somewhere around the second muddy crossing. You notice the old hands barely speak while they do this. They look judge and act. That is how experience often appears, not heroic, just fast. One glance at bent grass, another at the sky, one sniff of the air, and they know more than a guidebook can explain in 6 reassuring pages. Plenty of emigrants carried published trail guides, especially after the route became better known in the 1840s. Some were practical, some were wildly cheerful, in a way that now feels almost criminally upbeat. A fine road west, they might as well say, if you ignore the ruts, cholera, oxen thirst, and existential fatigue. Human beings do enjoy advertising hardship as opportunity when the hardship belongs to someone else. A quirky detail from trail life appears here in the matter of sagebrush and buffalo chips. In areas short on timber, emigrants often burn dried animal dung for fuel, especially on the plains. It is one of those historical facts that arrives with a certain dignity in textbooks, and then becomes much funnier when you picture yourself crouched over breakfast, grateful for a fire built from yesterday's digestive achievements. Still needs are needs, and nobody on the trail can afford to be precious for long. The camp smell changes as more fires catch. Smoke from grass, brush and chips hangs lower than wood smoke, thinner and sharper. It gets into your throat. It settles in your hair. It will remain in wool and canvas until everything you own smells like a camp that is trying very hard. The scent is not exactly pleasant, but it means heat, and heat is enough to inspire affection. You look down at the earth where your wagon now stands. It is uneven naturally. Of course it is uneven. The prairie never offers a smooth sleeping platform unless it is trying to lure you into a swamp. Someone kicks away a stone, Someone else tosses down a little straw. Blankets may go over boards later, but every lump beneath the wheels feels important already. A bad tilt can send sleepers sliding into one another all night, which sounds charming only if you have never been pressed at 3 a.m. against a crate corner while a relative snores into your ear. There is also caution about water, though not too much closeness to it. Camps need access to streams or springs if possible, yet setting up too near can bring trouble. Mud insects, fouled water and colder air gather there. Some parties learn this the hard way, which is the frontier method of education most widely available and least warmly reviewed. Historians still debate how consistently emigrant parties followed the advice in trail manuals, because necessity often overruled wisdom. If the only water was down in an exposed hollow, then down into the exposed hollow, you went carrying buckets and your better judgment. Now the light is nearly gone. The horizon holds one thin strip of faded gold, and above it the sky is turning a deep bruised blue. Camp noises sharpen as sight fades. Chains clink. Hooves shift. A baby cries with a weary outrage that suggests all migration should have been postponed until warmer weather. Someone laughs softly. Someone argues about where to hang a lantern. The lantern loses because fuel is precious and darkness is free. You feel the cold more clearly now that you have stopped moving. That is the trick of evening labour. While you work, your body pretends everything is manageable. The moment you pause, it sends a formal complaint. Your fingers sting. Your nose goes numb at the tip. The air tastes clean in the cruel way very cold air does, as if it has been stripped of softness. When you inhale too quickly, your chest tightens. The inside of your mouth feels dry. A few children are tucked close to the fires while bedding is sorted. Some will sleep in wagons. Some may sleep under them if weather allows and space demands it. Privacy in this life is more concept than daily experience. A covered wagon at night is a box of layered compromise. People, food sacks, tools, clothing and hopes are all expected to make room for one another. You start to understand that choosing the ground is part of choosing the night itself. Not just where you stop, but how you suffer. There is a brief sense of achievement once the wagon is settled, the animals seen to, and the campsite arranged as well as circumstances permit. It is not joy exactly. More a tired nod from the universe. You have done what can be done. The rest is weather luck and patience. You stand beside the wheel and look out across the line of dim wagons. Little fires blink among them like cautious stars. Voices drift, then fade. The land beyond remains vast and unreadable. Somewhere in that darkness is tomorrow's road, but tonight is here under your boots in the stiffening ground and the slant of wind against canvas. You know now why the choice of campsite lingers in memory. A good place cannot make the night easy, but a bad place can make it endless. So you keep this rise, this patch of drier earth, this modest break from the wind, and accept it with gratitude that would seem absurd anywhere else. Then you turn back toward the fire because supper still waits, and after that the wagon itself, where all this careful choosing will finally be put to the test. You come back to the fire with that small grim satisfaction of a person who has helped arrange misery into its least inconvenient form. The wagon is as well placed as it will be. The oxen have been seen to. The ground has been judged, rejected, improved, and finally accepted with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for tax forms. Now all that remains is supper in the dark. The fire is not large. Large fires are for stories, celebrations, or people who have found an excellent supply of wood and somehow also retain the energy to haul it. This one is modest and practical. A low working glow with a few brighter tongues of flame licking around the blackened pot. It throws out just enough warmth to make your face feel alive while your back remains firmly informed that winter has not in fact been cancelled. You crouch near it and hold out your hands. The heat lands on your knuckles first, then your palms, and for a moment the relief is so sharp it almost hurts. Behind that warmth, the rest of you stays cold. Your knees are stiff. Your shoulders ache from a day spent walking, lifting, bracing, and pretending you do not mind any of it. The air smells of smoke, singed, grease-damp wool, and the faint, sweet trace of crushed grass underfoot. The whole camp has that layered evening scent of people trying very hard to be domestic in a place that does not naturally encourage domesticity. Someone ladles out supper. It is not artistic. It is not varied. Nobody here is describing hints of nutmeg or a bright finish on the palate. It is food built around necessity, and necessity has very little interest in elegance. Salt pork beans, coffee, maybe a little bacon grease used as if it were precious gold, because in a way it is. Flour, cornmeal, rice-dried apples and hard bread often travelled in emigrant wagons because foods that kept well mattered more than foods that charmed. That is one of the solid, ordinary truths of the trail. Meals were often repetitive, heavy and plain, but warmth mattered almost as much as calories when night came on. You take your portion and sit where the firelight reaches the tin cup and not much else. The spoon is cold at the handle and warm at the bowl. The food itself is thick in places, watery in others, and absolutely wonderful because it is hot. You can feel the heat as it goes down a small travelling comfort through the centre of your body. It does not last long, but while it does, you are willing to forgive nearly everything. Around you, other people eat with that quiet concentration produced by hunger and fatigue. Conversation comes in short stretches. Nobody wants to waste energy on elaborate storytelling unless the story includes practical information or a joke strong enough to justify itself. A woman tears bread into smaller pieces for 2 children beside her. A man blows on his coffee and stares into the fire as though trying to negotiate with tomorrow. One of the boys near the wagon tongue drops. His spoon mutters something tragically sincere about his bad luck and has to grope for it in the dark. The night is still gathering. The last of the sky has gone from blue to grey to something that feels more like absence than colour. Fires become the centre of the world simply because they are visible. Faces appear and fade in the moving light. The canvas covers of the wagons loom pale and soft-edged behind them, ghostly and practical at the same time. Beyond that, the prairie is just a dark breathing space. There is a special discomfort in eating outdoors when the cold is creeping upward. The food cools quickly. Coffee loses heart with astonishing speed. Fingers become clumsy. If you set the cup down too long, it returns to your hand as if offended. You learn very fast to eat while things are warm because warmth is never loyal on the trail. It visits, it does not stay. A more curious note from emigrant life slips in here with the matter of bread. Some trail kitchens produced what later people fondly called ash cake or camp bread dough, baked in simple fashion, near coals or in Dutch ovens when the equipment was available. It sounds rustic and delightful in the kind of recipe article that ends with a photograph of linen napkins. In practice, it could range from comforting to alarmingly dense. More than one traveller probably took a bite and wondered whether the bread was intended for eating or for reinforcing wagon wheels. You notice how supper does more than fill the stomach. It marks a boundary. Day work ends here, night work begins. Once the bowls are scraped and the cups tipped back for the last lukewarm swallow, there will be no more pretending this is a pause before comfort. Supper is the thin, warm line between exertion and exposure. The sounds of camp change as people finish eating. Pots are wiped, spoons knocked against tin. Water is measured carefully. Nothing is wasted if it can be helped. Waste on the trail has a way of reappearing later as regret. You hear someone shake out a grain sack and fold it neatly. You hear the crackle of brush added to the fire. You hear a baby fuss with the outraged rhythm of a tiny person who has no interest in historical adventure and would on balance prefer a proper house. There is also the human instinct to improve morale with comments that are not entirely false. Could be worse, somebody says, which is always technically true and almost never emotionally helpful. Another replies that at least the wind has not risen. This is the sort of statement the wind hears as a challenge. You glance outward over the plain and half expect the darkness itself to smirk. Historians still argue over how much emigrants understood in advance about the daily strain of overland travel, because letters home and later memoirs often blur memory with pride. Some descriptions are stoic, some are almost cheerful, others read like the polite version of a complaint too large to fit on the page. Sitting there with your supper cooling and your feet throbbing in your boots, you suspect many people understood just enough to begin and not enough to refuse. The children are the truest measure of the hour. They grow glassy-eyed. One leans against a parent's side and simply stops participating in the world. Another begins to cry over something tiny, and then cannot stop because the thing underneath is not the lost crust, or the wrong blanket, or the sibling's elbow. The thing underneath is exhaustion, and it has won. A mother smooths hair back from a hot forehead. A father makes a joke in a tired voice, and gets half a smile for the effort. Tenderness here is not ornate. It is efficient. It keeps moving. You finish your food and realise too late that the heat it gave you is already thinning. The cold comes back around the edges first. Toes, ears, the bridge of your nose, then your hands once they leave the fire. The iron pot beside the coals gleams faintly black and silver. Smoke drifts into your face and makes your eyes sting. You blink and for a second the stars above seem to shiver. A mainstream fact about trail routine appears in these moments as plainly as the moon. Most emigrants rose very early and travelled long days, often beginning before dawn, to make use of cool, morning hours and animal strength. Which means that even if the night feels endless, nobody can afford to stay up dramatising it for long. Sleep, however imperfect, is not a luxury, it is raw fuel, so there is no leisurely lingering after supper. Bedding must be sorted, coals banked or judged for morning use, animals checked once more, wet things separated from drier things if anyone still has the will. Layers are counted. Blankets are negotiated over with the same fragile diplomacy nations might use over disputed borders. You stand and feel the ache in your legs immediately. The fire has softened you just enough to make movement unpleasant again. Your spoon goes away. Your cup is emptied. A woman nearby wraps leftover food with the solemn care of someone protecting treasure. Nothing hot remains except the memory of it in your chest. The dark is complete now. The cold feels sharper because there is no light left to distract from it. The wagon waits a few paces away under its canvas arch. Inside are the boards, the bedding, the cramped space, the smell of dust and cloth and stored lives. No one announces that the night has become serious. It simply has. You take one last hold of the fire's warmth with your eyes, with your hands, with the front of your coat. Then you turn from it, already missing it, and prepare to climb into the wagon, where comfort will be attempted with blankets, patience, and a level of optimism that would impress saints. You leave the fire reluctantly, the way a person leaves the last warm room in a house to step into an unheated hallway. Only this hallway is the entire American West, and it has no interest in your comfort. The light behind you flickers against the wagon wheel, and ahead of you, the canvas cover hangs pale in the dark, looking almost gentle from a distance. That is one of the wagon's clever little lies. By day it promises shelter. By night it reveals itself as a wooden crate with opinions. You climb up carefully because fatigue makes simple movements feel oddly ceremonial. One hand on the frame, one foot on the wheel hub, a small twist of the body to avoid knocking into the cover. Then inside, where the air is less windy but somehow more intimate in its discomfort. The smell hits you first. Canvas dust, old wood leather straps, dried mud wool blankets, faint grease, maybe a trace of coffee, or flour from a sack not tied quite tightly enough. It smells like travel itself, packed close. The interior is dim enough that shapes blur together. Crates become knees. Bundles become backs. Nothing is where comfort would have put it. Everything is where survival and transport demanded. That is the plain reality of emigrant wagons. Most were built to haul supplies, not to provide sleeping chambers, and families adapted the space as best they could. People often slept on, around, or between boxes of goods using feather ticks, quilts, buffalo robes, or straw-filled mattresses if they had them. You're not entering a pioneer bedroom, you're arranging your body among inventory. You kneel first because standing fully is not an option, unless you enjoy striking your head on curved wood and losing your last affectionate thought about civilization. The floorboards feel hard even through your clothes. Somewhere under a folded blanket, a wagon bolt creates a small ridge precisely where nobody would want one. You pat around for a better place and discover instead a spoon, a boot, and what may be a folded apron, or maybe a surrendered flag from a previous domestic battle. Frontier organisation tends to degrade after sunset. Bedding comes out in layers, and every layer has a history. A quilt stitched back in Ohio. A patched wool blanket that smells faintly of lanolin and smoke. A feather bed flattened by weeks of use into something more philosophical than soft. Perhaps a buffalo robe, heavy and musky with the fur worn thin in places and still marvellous against the cold. Travellers often prized buffalo robes for warmth on the plains, though not every family could get one. If you have one now, you treat it with deep respect and perhaps a little more affection than you intended to lavish on an animal's skin this evening. You spread what you can over the boards. The process is less making a bed than negotiating a truce. Blankets have to cover both people and awkward objects. A crate must stay within reach because tomorrow it will matter urgently, but tonight it is also an excellent instrument for bruising the hip. A sack of clothing can be shifted into service as a pillow. Flour sacks, folded coats, and bundled shawls all enter the night's campaign under the hopeful category of padding. There is a tiny art to this. Too much softness in one place leaves another exposed. Too many goods near the centre leave no room to turn. If you place the heaviest item near the wheel, well, perhaps it will stay still. If you place it near your feet, perhaps you will kick it before dawn and say something unpoetic into the darkness. Some wagon sleepers tucked boards across interior supports to make rough platforms, while others simply used the main bed of the wagon and accepted the consequences. Accounts from the trail suggest that comfortable enough was often the highest available standard, which is both honest and bleakly funny. A stranger little detail from emigrant life appears in the matter of personal treasures. Even in cramped wagons, some families still carried unnecessary but deeply loved items. Small mirrors, teacups, family Bibles, candlesticks, sewing baskets, musical instruments, or framed pictures wrapped in cloth. It sounds impractical, and in many ways it is. Yet when you are preparing a bed on top of practical misery, the thought of one nice object from home begins to feel less foolish. A person can survive on flour and grit for a while, but the heart likes evidence that it once belonged to a gentler room. You sit back on your heels and test the arrangement. The wagon creaks softly. Outside, the camp has thinned into scattered noises. A cough, a low murmur, the clink of a chain. Farther off, an animal shifts its weight in the grass. Inside, the air is still enough that you can hear fabric moving when someone beside you settles in. This closeness changes your sense of the body. Every elbow matters. Every folded knee becomes geography. Sleeping here means entering into an agreement with other people's breathing. There is no graceful way to lie down. You lower yourself by inches, aware of each complaint from your back. One shoulder finds a lump. Your left calf meets an unyielding corner. Your neck lands at an angle that would make a proper mattress file charges with the authorities. You adjust, then adjust again, then perform the classic bedtime maneuver of frontier life, which is to pretend for a moment that perhaps this is not so bad. It is a brave little lie, and you are welcome to it. Your blanket comes up around you. The wool scratches faintly at your chin. Beneath it, your clothes feel bulky and slightly damp from the day's effort, especially at the cuffs and collar. Many trail travellers slept partly dressed or fully dressed in cold weather, because undressing would have meant surrendering precious heat and complicating the escape back into morning labour. Modesty is all very well, but frost has a way of reorganising priorities. The wagon cover above you curves like a pale ceiling. In the dark it seems lower than it did before. You can make out the faint ribs of the bows that hold the canvas aloft. Tiny draft snakes through somewhere near the tailgate. You feel it pass over your forehead, cool and deliberate. So even here in this supposed refuge, the outside world is still invited in. There is also the question of noise, though, that will matter more as the hours go on. For now the wagon itself speaks in small sounds as bodies settle and wood answers the shift in weight. A board taps lightly. Leather gives a soft sigh. Someone nearby pulls a blanket tighter and the fabric whispers against itself. These are close sounds, domestic in a rough way, and for a moment they almost make the space feel safe. Even so, experts do not entirely agree on how often emigrants actually slept inside wagons versus outside them under the stars or beneath the vehicle. Whether family-sized terrain and available bedding all changed the answer. On milder nights, many people preferred the open air, but on a freezing one like this, the covered wagon becomes a compromise worth taking however cramped. It offers a little break from the wind, a little gathered warmth, and the comforting illusion of a walls. You find your place at last, or something near it. One arm tucked, one knee bent, shoulder angled away from the crate, head on a rolled coat that smells faintly of sweat smoke and home. The boards under you remain hard with almost moral determination. They do not soften, they do not pity, they simply exist. And that may be the truest sensation of all. The bed is not built for dreams, it is built for continuation, for making it to dawn without losing too much heat, patience, or strength. You lie there feeling every inch of the wagon's honesty and realize that on the Oregon Trail even rest has edges. You lie still for a while, partly because you are tired, and partly because moving again would mean renegotiating every hard surface under your body. The wagon has settled around you now. The little adjustments are done. The last blanket has been tugged into place. Outside, the campfires have dropped lower, their glow thinning into red clusters here and there across the dark. Inside the cover you are enclosed at last, though. Enclosed is not the same thing as comfortable, and certainly not the same thing as warm. At first the wagon seems to offer protection. The wind no longer strikes you full in the face. The canvas holds back some of the night. The darkness feels closer, more contained. It is almost enough to let you believe that sleep may come in an orderly fashion. Then your own breathing begins to change the air. That is the quiet trick of a covered wagon on a cold night. It is not a house, but it is not the open plain either. It becomes a tiny climate of its own, shaped by fabric, wood, breath wool, and whatever dampness people have carried in with them from the day. Warm air from bodies rises under blankets, only to meet cold canvas overhead. Moisture collects. The air grows close and chill at once, which seems impossible, until you are lying in it. Your nose stays cold while the space under the blanket grows stuffy. Your cheek feels the icy drift above while your own breath warms the cloth near your mouth. You're simultaneously underdressed for winter and overdressed for the small weather system you have created. The canvas overhead has a smell that deepens at night. In daylight it is mostly cloth and dust. Now it carries the faint mineral scent of cooled air and old smoke. Every now and then it gives a small, restless twitch when the breeze finds it. That motion makes a dry rubbing sound, soft but very distinct, like a sleeve moving against rough plaster. You begin to notice these tiny noises because there is nothing to do but notice. This was one of the practical limits of wagon shelter on the trail. The covers were usually made of heavy canvas, sometimes treated with linseed oil or other substances to shed rain better, though not always perfectly. Such covers blocked some wind and precipitation, but they did not insulate in the modern sense. A winter coat keeps a promise. Wagon canvas offers more of a suggestion. You exhale and watch a faint cloud appear in the dark before vanishing. The air above the blanket is cold enough for your breath to show even within the wagon. That would be charming in poetry and deeply unconvincing as evidence of a cozy sleeping space. Beside you, someone shifts and draws the bedding higher. Another sleeper gives a low sigh through the nose, the sound of a body trying to settle into conditions it did not personally approve. Soon the cold and the damp begin their little partnership. Moisture from breathing, from worn clothes, from wool that never quite dried, all of it hangs close. It is not enough to soak anything dramatically. It is worse than that. It is enough to make edges clammy. The blanket near your mouth grows cool. A fold of cloth under your hand feels faintly damp. The collar of your shirt, which was merely uncomfortable before now, seems to carry the entire climate of the Pacific Northwest in miniature. A less famous but delightful detail from overland travel is that some emigrants used newspapers, spare cloth or bits of extra fabric in creative ways to block drafts or pad spaces. It is the kind of frontier improvisation that sounds clever until you remember you are essentially trying to outwit the weather with old paper and optimism. Still, the effort matters. Human dignity has always included stuffing cracks with whatever is available and calling it a system. You turn your face slightly toward the wagon side and feel colder air slipping in where the cover does not sit perfectly against the body. There are always gaps, tiny ones, irregular ones, enough to remind you that the world outside has not vanished. Frost is likely forming somewhere out there already, silvering grass, tightening puddles, crisping the topmost layer of earth. If the temperature drops far enough, you may find the inside of the canvas rimmed with a thin breath, made visible by dawn. There is a curious intimacy in hearing other people breathe, not speak, not laugh, not give instructions, just breathe. Slow breaths, uneven breaths, a child's thin whistle through a blocked nose, the heavier rhythm of someone already half asleep. In a proper room, such sounds can disappear into walls and distance. In here, they are part of the fabric of the night. You become aware of every living person around you as warmth sources, comfort sources, irritation sources, and proof that you are all enduring the same thing together. Researchers have long differed on how severe nighttime cold was remembered compared with other trail hardships, because diaries often focus on illness accidents, river crossings, or shortages before mentioning ordinary sleeping misery. Yet the body remembers repeated discomfort with extraordinary loyalty. Ask anyone who has ever spent a night too cold, too cramped, or too alert to drift off properly. The memory sticks in the muscles. You pull the blanket closer over your shoulders and instantly change the conditions beneath it. A pocket of warmer air gathers around your chest and chin, but breathing into that little cave makes it stale within minutes. Leave an opening and cold flows in. Close it too tightly, and the blanket captures your damp breath until the fabric turns chilly against your lips. It is a ridiculous equation with no satisfying answer. You are not sleeping so much as conducting negotiations with wool. Then there is the floor. The boards underneath are no less firm than they were 10 minutes ago. In fact, they seem to have become more expressive. A hip begins to ache where a ridge presses through the bedding. One shoulder goes numb. A heel catches against a seam in the blankets. You move cautiously, aware that every adjustment sends a quiet ripple through the wagon. The wood answers with a creak. Someone else murmurs but does not wake. Outside, the last camp sounds thin further. A final cough. A horse stamping once. The low crack of a dying ember collapsing inward. The prairie beyond all that is wide and black and utterly uninterested in whether you get decent rest. That is one of the more humbling sensations of the trail. Nature is not especially cruel in a theatrical sense. It is merely vast, steady, and completely free of obligation toward your personal sleep quality. You breathe again, and feel the cold catch in your nostrils. The tip of your nose remains uncovered because covering it feels suffocating. This is a common winter dilemma in every era, though fewer modern people have had to solve it, while lying atop household supplies in a canvas wagon somewhere between one uncertain future and another. Your eyelashes feel dry. Your hands, despite being tucked close, seem to lose warmth one finger at a time. The wagon cover gives another soft tremor overhead. For a brief moment, moonlight or starlight finds the cloth and shows its texture faintly woven, faintly glowing. Then darkness closes again. You imagine the frost gathering outside, quiet as dust. You imagine the world whitening while you lie inside this moving box that is not moving, waiting for sleep that is slow to arrive. And perhaps that is the deepest sensation of the hour. Not drama, not panic, just a long awareness of your own body in cold air, every breath entering, warming, leaving and turning the wagon into a little chamber of chill and moisture around you. It is intimate, uncomfortable, and strangely unforgettable. You do not fall asleep so much as drift toward it, pause at the edge, and then get tugged back by the world outside the wagon. Night on the trail is never silent enough to forget where you are. The covered wagon muffles things, yes, but it does not erase them. It only changes their shape. Sounds arrive, softened, stretched, or oddly sharpened, until every little noise seems to carry a meaning it may not deserve. At first you hear the nearest things. The wagon wood gives an occasional faint complaint as weight settles and temperature drops. Cloth rubs against cloth. Someone beside you lets out a long breath, and then another, the rhythm, nearly even now. Beneath that comes the gentler language of camp beyond the cover, a low cough, a quick clearing of the throat, the small sleepy cry of a child who does not quite wake, but is not entirely at peace either. Then farther out the deeper sounds begin. The oxen are the loudest living certainty. They shift their weight with patient heaviness, making the chains or yokes answer in small metal clicks. Every now and then one breathes out in a damp gust, almost like a sigh from a bellows. Another tears at the grass with a slow ripping pull. It is an oddly comforting noise once you grow used to it. Grazing means calm. Calm means nothing is urgently wrong. You start to understand why emigrants listened so carefully to their animals after dark. When the stock settled, people could almost settle too. Then a mule stamps. Somewhere else a horse snorts suddenly, as if offended by a thought. A dog circles twice in the grass tags, tinkling faintly, before dropping down with a little grunt. The trail by day is wheels, voices, commands, dust movement. By night it becomes breathing, shifting, chewing, rustling. The whole camp turns animal. This is not imagination. Livestock truly sat at the centre of overland survival. Oxen were especially valued by many emigrants because they were strong, relatively hardy, and better suited than horses to the slow, brutal work of hauling wagons across long distances. They were not glamorous, which may explain why later romantic retellings have often preferred horses. But glamour does not pull a loaded wagon across mud, alkali, and rock with the steady patience of an ox who has long since stopped expecting applause. You lie there listening, and the darkness makes everything larger. That is one of night's oldest talents. A single clink sounds like a warning. A rustle becomes a possible stranger. A cough from another wagon seems closer than it really is. Your ears begin to do what tired human ears always do in uncertain places. They search for patterns. They promote ordinary noises into possible threats. It is not melodrama. It is simply how the mind behaves when sight retires and responsibility does not. The prairie itself has its own voice. Grass brushes against grass in long dry whispers when the breeze passes through. Somewhere a branch cracks, the whether from an animal or from cooling wood you cannot tell. The wind moves across the canvas in slow strokes, making a soft pressing sound that comes and goes. It is not strong enough to rattle the whole wagon, but enough to remind you that beyond this cloth is a great open dark with very few manners, A more unusual little trail note belongs here too. People sometimes tied bells to animals or used other simple noise-making devices to help keep track of stock at night. It sounds picturesque until you picture yourself trying to sleep, while a determined creature produces irregular metallic commentary somewhere beyond the wagon. Frontier security as so often arrives hand in hand with frontier annoyance. There were other sounds emigrants feared for good reason. A sharp break in the pattern of the herd, repeated barking, hoofbeats where there should be none, angry shouting from another camp. In some regions there was also anxiety about theft, straying animals, storms, or encounters with strangers. Yet the more common truth of most nights was not dramatic danger, but strained attention. People worried because they were far from home, tired and responsible for nearly everything they owned. A person guarding a wagon train was not only guarding life. He was guarding flour blankets, tools, draft animals, cooking pots, medicines, and tomorrow's chance of moving at all. You hear footsteps, now slow and careful, someone making a final check of the stock or the fire. The tread passes close to the wagon and then away. Boots on dry ground have a soft scuffing sound here, less crisp than on a floorboard, more secretive. For a moment you hold your breath to listen better. That is how quickly night trains you. In daylight you would barely notice a man walking by. In the dark you listen as if the earth itself were delivering a message. A baby begins crying in earnest somewhere across camp. The sound rises thin and desperate, then breaks into gasping little sobs. A woman's murmur follows low and repetitive. Not words you can catch, only the shape of reassurance. Gradually the crying eases. Then a man coughs deep and rough, the kind of cough that seems to begin in the boots and travel upward. Someone answers with the sleepy irritation of a person who has heard that cough many times already and failed to cure it. Specialists looking back at emigrant life have pointed out that night sounds could carry social information as much as environmental warning. You learned who was sick, who had a baby, who snored, who checked the animals diligently, who let the fire die too soon, who comforted others, who grumbled, who prayed aloud, and who lay very quiet because they had nothing left to spend. Darkness hid faces but revealed habits. Your own imagination, unfortunately, is eager to assist. A shifting shadow outside the wagon becomes for 1 second a figure. A scraping noise turns into the start of a disaster. The oxen moving together make such a heavy, soft surge that you picture them all breaking loose and wandering into tomorrow. Then nothing happens. Of course nothing happens. But the body has already tightened, and loosening it again is not easy. There is also that special nighttime embarrassment of being alarmed by entirely harmless things. A loose strap taps the wagon side. A blanket corner brushes your cheek. Someone mutters in sleep. You startle anyway, then lie there annoyed at yourself, which is not restful either. Fatigue strips away your civilized confidence. You become a creature listening under cloth. At some point an owl calls from a distance. The sound slips across the dark hollow and brief, then vanishes. For a moment the camp seems to pause around it. Even the animals feel stiller. Then the ordinary noises resume. Chewing, breathing, a low jingle, a long exhale through a nose. The whole wagon train continuing its business of not quite sleeping. Writers later dressing the Oregon Trail in romance often gave night a dramatic grandeur, and to be fair, there is grandeur here. The stars overhead are enormous, the land wide beyond measure, and the human camp very small. But what you notice from inside the wagon is not grandeur first. It is texture. The stitch of sound that holds the hours together. The fact that no one is ever fully alone because every small life around you keeps making itself known, and that may be the strangest comfort of all. The noises disturb your rest, yes, but they also keep you company. An ox pulling at grass, a child breathing through a blocked nose, a far cough, a dog settling into the earth, the whisper of canvas under wind. Each one says the same quiet thing in a different voice. We're still here. We're still making it through the night. You finally begin to drift, not gracefully, not all at once. Sleep approaches in scraps the way warmth does out here, uncertainly and with conditions attached. Your eyes grow heavy, your thoughts loosen. The sounds outside blur at the edges. For a few moments you almost forget the boards beneath you and the cold nibbling at your face. Then your foot finds a draft, or your shoulder settles too long against a hard seam, or your own shiver rises from somewhere deep and involuntary and you are awake again. This is what cold does to sleep. It breaks it into pieces. You lie there half wrapped in blankets, learning the awkward mathematics of surviving a freezing night without ever quite sinking into rest. If you tuck yourself tighter, you trap a little more warmth, but your knees ache. If you stretch out, a ribbon of cold slips under the bedding and runs along your shin like icy water. If you cover your mouth, your breath dampens the cloth. If you leave it uncovered, your lips go dry and chilled. Every choice comes with a complaint attached. The body under these conditions never quite trusts the night. Even when you're tired enough to sleep standing against a fence post, part of you stays on watch. Your muscles tense and release in tiny guarded cycles. Your hands creep back under your arms. Your shoulders hunch. Your jaw tightens. It is not fear exactly. More a stubborn physical alertness, as if the body keeps whispering, "Don't get too comfortable. This is not a room. This is a test." People on the overland trails knew this kind of night well, especially in shoulder seasons and at higher elevations, where temperatures could swing sharply after sunset. Even after a day that seemed tolerably mild, the air could turn hard by midnight. The broad historical picture reminds us that emigrants were dealing not only with mileage and geography, but with constant exposure to weather, often with limited shelter and no reliable way to dry or warm everything properly after a cold evening set in. The wagon helped, yes, but only in the way a hat helps in a storm. Better than nothing, not remotely enough. You begin to doze again. Thoughts loosen into fragments. The fire, the wheel, the coffee cup, a road somewhere ahead. Then a violent full-body shiver snaps through you and drags you back. It starts in the spine and runs outward, rattling your teeth so lightly you barely hear it, though you feel it everywhere. You hold still afterward, annoyed, as if your own body has interrupted something important. Shivering is its own exhausting labour. That may be one of the least glamorous truths of cold weather. The body spends energy trying to keep itself warm, and the effort is not subtle. You feel it in tiny quakes at first, then in the dull fatigue that follows. By morning, a night like this can leave you more tired than before you lay down. You've been technically horizontal for hours, and somehow less restored than a chair. A curious bit of frontier wisdom appears here in the widespread love of shared warmth. Children bundled together, siblings pressed side by side, adults sharing blankets. Dogs occasionally welcomed far closer than etiquette would allow in ordinary society. In a proper parlour, everyone has views about decorum. At 2 a.m, inside a freezing wagon, decorum can step aside for thermodynamics. Warmth has always been an excellent social reformer. You listen to the sleeping rhythms around you and try to match them. Someone nearby seems to have managed the impossible and reached real sleep, the kind with long, steady breaths and no restless shifting. It feels almost insulting. You, meanwhile, are conducting an all-night correspondence with every exposed patch of skin on your body. Your left ear is cold, then your right hand, then both feet, though one more than the other, for reasons too petty to understand. You draw your legs closer, which helps until your hip protests. The wagon cover overhead keeps out the worst of the moving air, but the cold still settles and lingers. It seeps from the boards below. It drifts through the tiny openings near the ends. It waits in the fabric of your clothes. Cold is not dramatic here. It is patient. That is what makes it effective. It does not need to win quickly. It just keeps pressing, asking the same question of your body over and over. How much heat can you spare? Some historians have questioned how often emigrant diaries underplayed ordinary nightly suffering, simply because discomfort became routine. Once pain, chill dust, and poor sleep are constant companions. A writer may stop mentioning them unless they become extreme. That silence can be misleading. A diary entry that merely says camped as usual may conceal a deeply unpleasant night, involving numb toes, coughing children, and a pillow made from folded trousers. Routine hardship often leaves the faintest paper trail and the strongest bodily memory. The strangest thing is that you do sleep, but only in slices. A minute here, 10 there. A shallow drifting state in which you are still aware of the wagon, still dimly aware of the cold, and yet not fully in charge of your thoughts. Then some small thing breaks it. A board creaks, a mule stamps, your nose goes numb, your arm falls asleep before the rest of you does. Back you come into the dark, into the wool, into the cold awareness of your own breathing. There is gentle sarcasm to be found in this, if only to keep morale from collapsing entirely. You crossed miles of prairie-managed livestock, arranged camp and engineered bedding, on top of a cargo platform, all for the privilege of spending the night playing a losing game against air. Civilization at moments like this seems less an achievement of government and philosophy than of walls that actually meet at the corners. You think about morning more than is useful. Not because morning will be pleasant exactly, but because it will be different. There may be fire again, movement, work, blood returning to fingers through sheer indignation. The promise of change becomes its own small comfort. Night when you cannot sleep properly feels permanent. Dawn is the necessary lie you tell yourself until it arrives. Another shiver comes smaller now. You press your hands tighter between your knees and chest. The blanket smells faintly of smoke and old wool. Your mouth tastes dry. The inside of your nose stings with cold. Somewhere under you a hidden ridge in the bedding seems to have grown sharper. You make a tiny adjustment and hear the wagon whisper in reply. No one else wakes, or if they do, they're too tired to announce it. Medical historians looking back on trail life often note how exposure and exhaustion work together. A single cold night might not break a healthy adult, but repeated nights of poor sleep, inadequate shelter, damp clothing and hard travel could wear down resilience in quiet but important ways. It is not one dramatic event, it is accumulation. The body has a budget and the trail keeps charging fees. At last, in one of those brief, merciful intervals, you sink a little deeper. Not far, just enough for thoughts to smear into dream fragments. The wagon sounds grow distant. The cold loses its sharp edges for a moment. You hover there half gone. Then your toes, apparently committed to active sabotage, remind you they exist, and you surface again with a weary inward sigh. So this is how the night passes, not in one long sleep but in bargains, a few minutes of rest in exchange for a numb hand, a little warmth gained by curling tighter, paid for by a cramp in the shoulder, a brief dream, then a shiver, another drift, another waking. The body working, always working, even in supposed rest. And somewhere in that broken rhythm you begin to understand a larger truth about the trail. Sleep is not simply sleep here, it is recovery rationed. It is survival carried out in the dark. It is the body's attempt to rebuild itself under conditions that would prefer it not bother. You wake to a small elbow in your ribs, though calling it an elbow may be generous. In the dark, all child limbs become abstract instruments of surprise. A heel lands somewhere near your thigh. A blanket edge gets pulled away by inches. Then comes the sleepy, wounded sound of a little person who has realized with deep moral outrage that the night is still cold, and that no adult in the wagon has solved it. Families on the Oregon Trail do not sleep in neat arrangements, however politely later paintings might suggest otherwise. They pile, fold, tuck, wedge, and improvise. Children are slid into the warmest gaps wrapped in shawls layered beneath quilts, or pressed between adults and older siblings in the old human arrangement of shared heat. In a roomy house, bedtime is a routine. In a covered wagon, bedtime becomes logistics. The child beside you whimpers again. Not fully awake, just miserable enough to announce an objection. A woman, perhaps the mother, shifts in the dark and reaches over with the automatic precision of someone who has been half asleep for years. Her hand finds the blanket, tugs it higher, pats once, then twice. A murmur follows, soft and steady, too low to catch word for word. It has the rhythm of reassurance, the kind that matters less for meaning than for tone. The child quiets a little, then sighs in that tragic theatrical way children do when life has offended them before dawn. What strikes you most is how little room there is for tenderness to look grand. It does not arrive in speeches, it arrives in adjustments. Someone gives up the drier edge of a quilt. Someone turns so a smaller body can fit near the chest. Someone wakes enough to rub cold feet through a blanket until they warm. It is care in the grammar of inconvenience. Accounts from the trail make it clear that children were everywhere in these wagon parties, and they shaped daily life more than dramatic retelling sometimes admit. Families with young children had to manage feeding sickness, boredom, fear accidents, and sleep, all while moving west over punishing ground. The journey was not made by rugged bachelors alone staring nobly at sunsets. It was made by households, and households come with toddlers' tears and the urgent nighttime question of who has kicked off the blanket now. Another detail that floats up from emigrant life is the use of makeshift cradles and swinging beds for infants when possible. Some families rigged simple hammock-like supports, padded boxes, or suspended bedding in wagons to soften the jolting for babies during travel. It sounds inventive because it is inventive. It also sounds like exactly the sort of thing a desperate parent would design after 3 days of listening to an infant protest every rut in Nebraska. The child beside you is not a baby, though. Old enough to complain, young enough to do it without restraint. A tiny cold hand pushes against your sleeve. You shift carefully and feel the whole arrangement of bodies respond. There is a choreography to shared sleep in cramped places. One turn of the shoulders in one corner can ripple through everyone else like wind through grass. Somewhere near your feet, another child mutters a few crosswords from within a blanket cave and then goes still. You can smell childhood in the wagon too, though nobody puts it that way. Milkwool slightly damp stockings, hair that smells of smoke and skin, and whatever soap has long since lost the battle. There is also the warm, faintly sour scent of sleep itself, of bodies packed close and breathing through the long hours. It is not elegant, but it is deeply human. A youngster starts coughing now, not violently, just that thick little winter cough that comes in bursts and seems to shake the whole small frame. The mother sits up a fraction enough for the wagon to creak and rubs the child back through the blanket. You hear the rustle of cloth, the touch of palm against wool, the nearly invisible labour of calming. No one applauds, no one even fully wakes perhaps. But this is the hidden soundtrack of family migration. Not only wheels and rivers and buffalo, but 1,000 nighttime corrections made by tired hands. Researchers do not all agree on how children experience the trail emotionally, because adult diaries often speak for them, rather than recording their own voices. Some memoirs written later remember adventure freedom animal stars. Others recall hunger fear and monotony. Likely it was both depending on age, temperament, weather, and whether one happened to be warm at the moment in question. Children live very much in the kingdom of immediate conditions. A glorious westward destiny means less than dry socks. The little one beside you finally settles, but only after winding fingers into the edge of your blanket as if claiming legal possession. There is no point resisting. Out here, blanket boundaries are theoretical. You surrender a corner and gain a strange sense of comradeship. This child does not know you well enough to admire your personality, but has concluded correctly that you are warm or at least less cold than the air. Then another crisis emerges from the darkness, a whispered "I have to go." No sentence has ever carried such weary force in the middle of a freezing night. A parent exhales long and resigned. There is fumbling, a search for shoes, or a shawl, or enough courage to face the cold outside. This too is part of the social history of the trail, and perhaps one of the least romantic. Entire family systems had to function without privacy plumbing or anything resembling convenience. If civilization rests on infrastructure, then the wagon camp at midnight is civilization stripped down to determination and a bucket. You hear quiet instructions, a sleepy protest, then movement toward the wagon opening. Cold air enters in one quick, thin rush when the cover is disturbed and everyone inside seems to feel betrayed at once. A baby somewhere in another wagon lets out an offended wail, perhaps in sympathy, perhaps in competition. The parent returns a minute later, breathing harder from the cold, and spends several patient seconds rewrapping child blanket, shawl, and peace treaty. There is somehow affection in all this confusion. Not sentimental affection, working affection. The sort that survives because it is enacted physically over and over. Pull, tuck, hold, lift, share, soothe. On the trail, family love is often visible through labour long before it is visible through words. A practical observation from emigrant records is that children sometimes adapted surprisingly fast to rough conditions, while adults collapsed inward with worry. The very young could sleep through alarming noises, wake laughing at dawn, or accept a lumpy bed as normal by the third miserable week. Then again, the same child might melt down because a biscuit broke wrong. Resilience and fragility are close cousins in childhood. To watch them side by side in a freezing wagon is to see human nature in miniature. At last the wagon grows quieter again. The coughing eases, the muttering stops. Tiny feet tucked under blankets become still. You can feel the nearness of everyone more than you can see them. A child's warm forehead briefly finds your shoulder and rests there. Another sleepy breath stirs the blanket near your wrist, and you realize something simple, almost embarrassingly simple. A freezing night in a covered wagon is never experienced by the body alone. It is experienced through the company of others, especially the smallest others, whose needs cut through exhaustion, discomfort, and private misery with perfect confidence. You might not sleep much. You might ache everywhere by dawn. But for these hours in this dim, packed space under canvas warmth is not merely a physical condition. It is something passed from person to person, one small adjustment at a time. The wagon grows quiet again, but not empty quiet. Never empty. It is full of the soft evidence that everyone is still managing somehow. A child breathing through a stuffy nose. The faint creak of someone easing weight off a sore hip. The woolly hush of a blanket being pulled a little higher. In that close darkness, you begin to notice another layer of the night, one less obvious than cold and harder boards. The work that continues after everyone is supposed to be done. A woman near you is not sleeping. You can tell by the rhythm. Too alert, too measured, restless in a contained way. Not tossing, because there is no room for tossing, but adjusting, planning, checking, listening. After a moment there is the tiny click of something metal, perhaps a pin, perhaps scissors, perhaps the clasp of a sewing kit opened in the dark by pure memory. Then the dry, soft drag of thread being pulled. It is such a small sound, yet it seems to reveal the entire hidden architecture of frontier life. The social world of the Oregon Trail did not stop at sundown. Women often kept working deep into evening long after cooking. Cleaning, child tending, packing, unpacking, and walking had already consumed the daylight. Clothes needed mending. Wet things had to be separated from dry ones if there was any hope of finding them again by morning. Food had to be protected. Children needed calming. Tomorrow had to be quietly assembled in the mind before anyone could risk lying still. The ordinary historical record bears this out again and again. Diaries and recollections frequently show women carrying an astonishing share of the invisible labour that kept wagon households functioning at all. You lie there listening to the faint movements, and begin to understand how much of that labour leaves almost no monument. A river crossing gets remembered, a mountain pass gets remembered, a death, a wedding, a buffalo hunt, a storm, those all survive in stories. But the midnight mending of a torn sleeve because there is only one decent shirt left for a growing boy, and morning frost makes everything harder that vanishes unless somebody writes it down. The woman shifts again. Fabric rustles. Perhaps she's not sewing after all. Perhaps she's only checking the children's blankets, then feeling for the medicine packet, then making sure the coffee sack has been tied against mice or damp. It hardly matters which task it is. The point is the same. Rest for her has to make room for responsibility. A less celebrated but telling detail from trail life is that sewing kits were among the prized practical possessions many women carried west, often with needles, thread pins, scraps and small scissors, guarded with the seriousness other people reserve for money. It makes perfect sense. Clothing did not simply wear out on the trail. It was attacked by dust weather friction, washing, hauling, kneeling and children. A missing button or torn seam could become a genuine problem when replacements were limited and the nearest proper store was somewhere behind you by several hundred miles. You think of the long day just past, the walking, the jolting wagon, the smoke in the eyes, the cooking over uncertain fires, the finding of water, the keeping of tempers, the cleaning of utensils in cold conditions that must have tempted everyone to fling the entire kitchen into the prairie and declare a fasting movement, and even after all that someone is still awake, still repairing the little tears that might become tomorrow's larger troubles. Some historians have suggested that women's experience of the trail is often flattened in popular memory into a single vague image of patient endurance, when in truth it involved a constant stream of managerial, emotional and physical decisions. That sounds academic until you lie inside a wagon and hear it for yourself. Patience is part of it, yes. But so are inventory control, emergency nursing, domestic engineering, conflict reduction, childcare, clothing, maintenance, and the miracle of producing order from sacks, boxes, fatigue and weather. Patient endurance makes it sound like sitting quietly with noble cheekbones. The reality is closer to running a collapsing household inside a moving crate with no supply chain. Then there is the mental labour, the sort no one sees at all. Who is getting feverish? Which child's cough is worsening? Whether the flour will last another 10 days? Whether a blanket can be spared to wrap an injured foot? Whether the creek water tasted wrong? Whether the axle grease is low, whether the man who said he would check the lashings actually checked them, or merely expressed optimism in their general direction. The frontier had an almost magical ability to turn every private thought into tomorrow's practical problem. You hear another careful motion in the dark, then a tiny sigh, not dramatic, just worn. There's tenderness in it, but also arithmetic. This much energy left. These tasks remaining, these people depending on me. Sleep perhaps if there is anything over after all of that. A fascinating domestic oddity from emigrant accounts is how often food preparation tools, sewing items and household objects were valued, right alongside obviously survival-oriented gear. Modern people sometimes imagine overland migration as one long masculine contest with terrain, all wheels and rifles and maps. Yet if the coffee pot cracked, if the needles were lost, if the wash basin split, if the children's clothing failed faster than it could be repaired, life unravelled quickly. Housekeeping sounds too mild a word for it. Household maintenance on the trail was systems management with smoke inhalation. You become aware of your own assumptions as you lie there. It is easy from a distance to imagine the freezing wagon night as a universal physical trial that affects everyone more or less the same. Cold, hard boards, poor sleep. True enough. But the cold lands differently depending on whether your mind is allowed to go blank. Some bodies are tired. Some are tired and still on duty. Experts continue to disagree about how far we should read modern categories into frontier gender roles because not every family worked the same way, and necessity often scrambled expectations. Men cooked, women drove, children fetched water, older daughters mothered younger siblings, widowers improvised, widows led. Still, there is little doubt that women's labour remained foundational and often undercounted, especially the labour that happened after the public work of the day appeared to be over. Inside the wagon, that truth feels less like a thesis and more like a pulse. A hand checking a forehead, a bundle retied, a hem pinched and examined, a quiet word breathed into a child's hair. You can almost map the whole social order of the wagon by who gets to become unconscious and who must keep listening. At last the movement's slow. The little metallic sound is gone. The fabric settles. Perhaps the mending is finished. Perhaps it has merely been postponed in favour of not collapsing. Outside, the animals continue their occasional shifting. Somewhere in camp, a low cough answers the night. The air inside the wagon remains close cold at the edges, heavy with breath and wool and endurance. And now you understand another part of what it felt like to sleep through a freezing night on the Oregon Trail. Not simply the cold against your skin, but the awareness that warmth itself is being actively maintained by labour, much of it quiet, much of it female, much of it so ordinary, that history nearly walks past without noticing. The blankets do not just exist. The calmer children do not just happen. The better arranged bedding, the mended mitten, the saved crust for dawn, the medicine found in the dark, the reassurance murmured before panic starts, these are built. You lie there drowsy and chilled, and the wagon no longer seems only a shelter. It becomes a workshop of care operating after hours, half asleep under canvas with numb fingers and no applause. And perhaps that is why the night, for all its discomfort, does not feel empty. Someone is always still holding it together. Eventually, even that quiet industry fades, and what remains is the denser, stranger atmosphere of a wagon. After midnight, when the work is mostly done, the children are mostly still, and the men who spent the evening moving with loud, practical certainty are forced into the same helpless position as everyone else, flat on their backs, cold, cramped, deeply mortal. The prairie is very democratic that way. You can hear one of them nearby not sleeping quite as soundly as he would probably like others to believe. He has the breathing rhythm of a man determined to seem unaffected by conditions that are plainly affecting him. There is a stubborn little force to it, slightly too steady, slightly too deliberate. Every now and then he clears his throat in the manner of someone announcing that he is fine, actually just adjusting. A moment later the wagon boards give a restrained complaint as he shifts for the fourth time in 10 minutes. There is a mild frontier comedy in this. By daylight, men on the trail often perform certainty because certainty is useful. Oxen need driving, wheels need lifting from ruts, rivers need crossing. Someone must say, we can manage that, even when what he means is, I have no good plan but panic seems unhelpful. Practical confidence becomes part of the gear. It keeps things moving, it steadies children, it calms animals, it may even calm the speaker. But the night strips some of that stage business away. It is difficult to look like a frontier hero while trying to tuck freezing feet under a blanket without waking 3 other people. Difficult to maintain a grand image of masculine endurance when your shoulder has gone numb against a flour sack and your nose has just discovered a draught no sermon could soften. The men in wagon camps were not insincere exactly. They were doing what many people do under pressure, turning necessity into identity. If a journey requires toughness, then toughness becomes a public language. Yet the body after midnight often replies in private dialect. Contemporary descriptions of the overland trails make clear that men's work was punishing and relentless, especially when it involved handling livestock, repairing wagons, scouting crossings, hunting or walking mile after mile beside the teams. Many adult men did far more walking than modern people imagine, Ride-in space was limited, and animals were too valuable to burden frivolously, so the body lying near you now stiff and restless under the blanket has likely earned every ache honestly. The trouble is that honest earning does not produce a softer bed. He shifts again. A long controlled exhale, then stillness, then another shift smaller this time as if he hopes the wagon will not notice. You want to laugh gently because the entire scene feels so familiar across centuries. Pride loves to describe hardship as character building right up until bedtime. Then Pride would very much like an extra pillow and perhaps a proper stove. There is also the matter of leadership. In many emigrant parties, men handled public decision-making more visibly, whether formally or by habit. They discussed route choices, stock tools, weather river depth, hunting repairs, and whether some guidebook writer deserved to be located and lectured. This outward role could make male discomfort look less important than duty. If others needed reassurance, a man might keep giving it long after his own reserves wore thin. Out here, appearances could become part of survival. A charmingly odd detail from the era is the way some men carried small luxuries that seemed absurdly personal beside the brute necessities of the trail. Pipes, shaving gear, favourite knives, keepsake books, or even bottles of hair oil and pomade have appeared in emigrant inventories and recollections. It is hard not to enjoy that. A person may be sleeping in a wagon beside an axle wrench and a sack of beans, yet still hope to part his hair with dignity in the morning. Civilization apparently dies one grooming habit at a time. The fellow nearby mutters something unintelligible in the dark. Not a dream exactly, more a tired objection to the entire arrangement. Then comes silence again, though not restful silence. It is the silence of endurance. You begin to understand that there are different kinds of sleeplessness in the wagon. The children's is urgent. The women's is attentive. The men's, or at least some of the men's, has a strange relationship with pride. They are uncomfortable, but also faintly embarrassed by the fact of discomfort, as if acknowledging it too fully might weaken something larger than one bad night. Of course, life on the trail regularly forced men into forms of dependence they may not have especially enjoyed. Illness, injury, weather, and fatigue ignored every lecture ever given about self-reliance. A sick man needed broth. A chilled man needed blankets tucked around him. A tired man needed someone else to wake first and stir the fire. The mythology of solitary masculine strength has always had a hard time surviving close domestic quarters. In a freezing wagon, everybody is some version of needy. Researchers still disagree about how frontier masculinity should be understood on the trail, because the evidence shows both toughness and vulnerability, often in the same person within the same week. Some men were domineering. Some were gentle. Some bragged. Some broke down. Some adapted easily to domestic labour when needed. Others sulked if asked to hold a baby and a coffee pot at once. Hardship did not create one simple model of manhood. It exposed the seams in whatever model people brought with them. You hear a soft whisper from farther down the wagon, perhaps a wife asking, "Are you awake?" The answer comes after a pause far too quickly to be honest. No. Then a rustle. Then more truthfully a little. It is almost sweet. Even the joke sounds tired. That small exchange reveals something important. Men on the trail were not only performing for one another, they were also seen by wives, sisters, mothers, daughters, and children who knew perfectly well when the performance slipped. The public version of a man could talk about weather as if it were a manageable inconvenience. The private version was lying in the dark, hoping someone had one more blanket corner to spare. There is no shame in that, though the sentry might not always have said so kindly. The cold itself cares very little for role. It takes heat from whoever is available. It stiffens the hands that held the reins and the hands that stirred the stew with equal impersonal fairness. It presses on men whose whole daytime identity depends on action and leaves them with nothing to do but wait for dawn. Some trail memoirs written later lean heavily on the language of cheerful fortitude, especially when men describe their own hardships. That may be memory polishing things or simply style. People like to remember themselves as braver than they felt at 2 a.m. Yet if you listen beneath the polished recollections, you often hear the truth anyway. Sleeplessness, numb feet, frost on blankets, joints aching from rough beds. Humour used as a blanket where wool ran short, and humour does matter. Without it, half the trail might have turned around in Iowa. Gentle sarcasm was a kind of fuel. The ability to observe while freezing under canvas that this was certainly an excellent vacation choice that was worth something. A joke could not warm the wagon, but it could make the cold feel less personally insulting. The man beside you settles, at last perhaps not asleep, but no longer fighting the conditions with such offended dignity. His breathing evens. The boards stop protesting quite so often. Outside, one of the oxen tears another mouthful of grass. Somewhere a bit of harness gives a tiny clink. The night goes on, and you lie there noticing one more thing about what it felt like to sleep in a covered wagon. The cold did not merely test muscle or stamina, it tested identity. It pared everyone back to basics, then left them to reconstruct themselves under a blanket, with whatever scraps of warmth, humour and patience remained. For the men in particular, perhaps that meant discovering that endurance was real, but so was need. And on the Oregon Trail, the honest version of toughness often looked less like swagger than like staying quiet, making room and getting through until morning. The wagon has settled into one of those deep night lulls that almost feel peaceful until an animal reminds you that the rest of the camp is enduring the same hours under the same cold sky. You hear it first as a low shifting weight outside, something large leaning, stepping, then pausing. A hoof presses into the ground. Leather gives a tiny squeak. A rope tightens. Then comes the soft, damp rush of breath from an ox rising through the dark like steam you cannot see. You lie there and think not for the first time that the animals are having a night very much like your own, only with fewer blankets and far less sympathy. That's one of the practical truths of overland travel people sometimes forget. Human comfort mattered, yes, but animal survival often mattered even more by raw necessity. A wagon train without healthy oxen, mules or horses could lose time, supplies, money, and sometimes the whole chance of reaching its destination intact. Livestock were not background scenery to the migration. They were engines, companions, investments, and the uneasy beating heart of the whole enterprise. Outside, the oxen graze when they can, though the grass at night is stiff with cold and losing its sweetness. Their mouths pull at it steadily anyway. Rip, chew, pause, breathe. The rhythm is patient, almost meditative. One animal shakes its head and a chain answers with a dull click. Another stamps once, then again, perhaps from the chill, perhaps from simple irritation, which is a mood livestock share generously with people. You can picture them even without seeing them well. Heavy bodies silvered faintly by starlight, horns or broad heads outlined against the dark, hide carrying the smell of earth sweat and weather, their warmth rising into the cold air while frost gathers on the ground around their hooves. No wagon cover for them, no layered quilt, no philosophical discussion of whether the blanket corner should be shared, just the long practical business of standing through the night and being ready somehow to pull again tomorrow. Oxen were widely preferred by many emigrants for good reason. They cost less than horses, were generally sturdier under heavy loads, and could graze more effectively on available prairie forage. They moved slowly, certainly, and no one wrote many poems about the glamour of oxen. But glamour is overrated when one must drag a household over mountains. The overland trails, for all their legends of daring and romance, were built on the patient labour of creatures with broad backs and low opinions of drama. A small but wonderful oddity from trail lore deserves mention here. Travellers sometimes developed real affection for particular draft animals and gave them names so human and familiar that they sound like neighbours from a village Buck Bright, Tom Jerry Kate. This always amuses slightly. You may be freezing under canvas in the wilderness, but somewhere nearby Tom the ox is chewing his way toward dawn with more composure than half the adults in camp. Not all the animals are calm, of course. A mule has opinions about the universe and expresses them by jerking at a tether or letting out a sudden snort that sounds scandalized by existence. Horses too can carry their nerves into the dark, especially if something startles them. Shifting shadow, a coyote far off, a loose strap touching the leg at the wrong moment. The energy of a frightened horse travels quickly through a camp. Even from inside the wagon you can feel how watchful people remain for those changes. Dogs have their part in the night as well. Nearly every camp seems improved by at least one dog, though the improvement may come mixed with barking at entirely imaginary crimes. Somewhere out there a dog gives a low, uncertain woof, then another, then settles with a huff as if embarrassed by the performance. Dogs on the trail could help with guarding companionship, herding and morale. They also shed stole food, tracked mud and made themselves indispensable in the exact ancient way dogs always have. From within the wagon the animal's sounds become strangely personal. An ox's breath seems close enough to feel. A hoof scraping earth sounds almost like a hand against wood. The rope creak, the harness jingle, the slow tearing of grass, these weave themselves into the structure of the night until you cannot imagine silence without them. If the camp was suddenly quiet, truly quiet, you suspect that would frighten you far more. That makes sense. Trail life depended on continual listening to stock. Men often got up during the night to check tethered animals, especially in uncertain weather. Poor pasture or regions where theft and wandering were concerns. Losing oxen could be disastrous. A missing blanket was misery. A missing team was catastrophe. So even when the human body begged for uninterrupted sleep responsibility, went outside in boots and cold breath, and counted moving shapes in the dark, writers and historians have not always agreed on just how emotionally attached emigrants became to their animals because records vary. Some accounts treat livestock strictly as property weighed in terms of strength, feed and value. Others reveal real tenderness, sorrow at losses, and even admiration. That range feels believable. Hardship often makes affection practical and practicality affectionate. A beast that pulls your wagon through mud survives bad water and stands shivering outside while you at least have canvas overhead begins to seem less like equipment and more like a stoic colleague. You think about that as another breath drifts through the darkness beyond the wagon wall. Warm, wet, alive. There is humility in it. Everyone in this camp is balancing need against exposure only in different forms. You crave fire, dry bedding, and another hour of sleep. The ox craves grass, stillness, and freedom from the yoke. The horse wants room to move. The dog wants to be near people and somewhere less frozen than the ground. No creature here has exactly what it would choose. There is also the plain unpleasant fact of animal smell which no romantic engraving can fully disguise. Warm hide manure, leather damp hair, trampled grass-old feed, and the broad organic scent of living bodies gathered close. In a barn this smell can feel almost cosy. In a wagon camp it drifts in and out on the cold, mingling with smoke and wool, and reminding you that survival is a very physical business. It is not pretty, it is honest. Then comes the sound every sleeper listens for without admitting it. A sharp movement in the herd. Not panic exactly, but enough to change the pattern. Heads lift. A rope strains. Something heavier than usual shifts across the ground. You feel the whole camp attend for half a second. Even inside the wagon, even half asleep, the ear notices. Then the sound settles. An animal resettling. Nothing worse. The tension drains, but only partly. Life on the trail trains the nerves to wake faster than the mind. A practical trail note fits here too. Because forage quality varied, and grazing could be poor in some stretches, emigrants sometimes had to ration feed cut grass, or worry constantly about whether their animals were getting enough strength back overnight. Morning was not merely about whether people had slept, it was about whether the teams were fit to haul again. One weak ox could alter the entire day's pace, One lost mule could complicate everything from scouting to hauling water, so as you lie there in your cramped nest of blankets, you realise the freezing wagon night extends well beyond your own bones. The whole camp is held together by living bodies enduring the weather in parallel. Human and animal all spending warmth, all waiting for dawn, all part of the same fragile moving system. And perhaps that is why the sounds outside feel oddly companionable even when they wake you. The ox breathing near the wheel, the mule stamping in protest, the dog circling down into the grass. They're not just noises. They are proof that the migration still exists, that the train has not dissolved into cold and darkness, that tomorrow, if everyone can keep enough life and heat in themselves until daylight, the wheels may yet turn again. The night has a second half, and it is meaner. By now the first exhaustion is gone, spent in those broken scraps of sleep and shivering wakefulness. What remains is a more used-up feeling, the kind that leaves the body heavy, but the mind oddly clear in all the wrong ways. Every cough sounds louder, every ache has had time to introduce itself properly. The wagon no longer feels like a temporary inconvenience, it feels like an argument that has gone on too long. Then someone nearby begins coughing in earnest. It starts as a low rough catch in the chest, then climbs into a deeper fit that seems to shake the bedding. The wagon boards the whole small airless world under canvas. You can hear the effort in it. Hear the lungs trying to clear something they do not have the strength to manage gracefully. Between coughs comes that thin pause everyone listens to without meaning, to the pause where you wonder whether the next breath will come easily or not. Illness travelled the overland trails as faithfully as any wagon. Cholera was the great terror in many seasons, especially in the late 1840s and early 1850s. But beyond the famous outbreaks, there was a whole ordinary kingdom of sickness that never made headlines in schoolbook memory. Colds, fevers, bowel troubles, inflamed eyes, bad teeth, infected cuts, strained backs, swollen joints, measles in children, exhaustion in adults, all of it riding west along with the flour barrels and the axle grease. A freezing night inside a covered wagon could turn mild discomfort into real suffering very quickly. The coughing person, perhaps a man, perhaps an older woman, perhaps someone whose age the dark has erased, tries to suppress it after a moment. That attempt fails spectacularly. Another fit comes, then another. Someone wakes fully beside them and sits up fast enough to make the wagon complain. You hear a hand rubbing a back, a whisper, the rustle of blankets being rearranged, then the faint metallic knock of a cup or bottle being found by touch. This is the part of history that rarely poses for portraits, not the heroic departure, not the grand river crossing, just a sick person half upright under a blanket, while another tired person in the dark tries to remember where the medicine packet was tucked, and whether there is any clean water left that is not so cold it will feel insulting. A small but memorable frontier detail belongs here. Many emigrant families carried patent medicines, tonics, bitters, liniments, laudanum, castor oil, peppermint camphor mustard, or homemade remedies packed with all the confidence of a society that had not yet learned how much of medicine was wishful theatre. Some of it helped a little, some of it merely tasted as if it ought to help. A spoonful of something sharp and dreadful could at least give the comforting illusion that action had been taken, which, to be fair, is half the emotional function of medicine in any century. The air in the wagon feels different once sickness becomes audible. Tighter, more watched. Even people still half asleep begin listening. The body knows when another body nearby is struggling. It shifts the whole emotional weather. Suddenly the cold seems less like your main enemy. It becomes a collaborator waiting for weak joints, damp lungs, worn-out immune defences, and people too tired to fight well. You can smell sickness too faintly but unmistakably. Hot skin under wool, breath a little sour. The medicinal ghost of camphor or peppermint, damp cloth, a human body working too hard in a place that offers it very little help. Someone uncorks something. Someone else mutters that the water is too cold. A child woken by the noise asks a drowsy question and receives a soft answer designed to end the conversation before fear spreads. Chroniclers of trail life often mention the limits of medical care in brutally simple terms. Doctors were not present in most wagon companies. Some trains had people with useful experience, midwives, mothers with practical knowledge, veterans of previous journeys, the occasional train physician travelling west himself. But formal care was scarce and supplies limited. Once you were sick out here, comfort and luck became major parts of the treatment plan. There is something very sobering about that. A fever in town is worrying. A fever 3 weeks from proper help becomes a different kind of sentence. The coughing eases for a moment, replaced by a weak wheeze and then a tired breath. Someone adjusts a blanket around the sick person's shoulders. You hear the little clumsy devotion of the act fabric dragged up under cold fingers, care delivered without speech because speech would only waste heat and energy. A second person in the wagon, now fully awake, offers a suggestion in a whisper. There's a brief discussion about whether to sit the patient higher or let them lie back. Both options sound uncomfortable. Both are uncomfortable. Experts remain divided on how much cold itself directly caused illness on the trail as opposed to worsening conditions already there. Modern understanding would caution against blaming chilly air alone, yet repeated exposure, poor nutrition, fatigue, dirty water, and crowded sleeping surely made bodies less able to cope. In plain human terms, the freezing wagon night did not have to invent sickness. It merely gave sickness a splendid opportunity. You lie still and become aware of your own chest, of your throat, of every tiny sensation that might, if you were less rational and more tired, convince you that you too are about to die of the weather. This is another gift illness offers a group: shared vigilance. Once someone starts coughing hard in the dark, everyone privately checks their own lungs for treachery. There were rheumatic pains as well, the broad category into which people of the period dropped all sorts of aches, stiffness and inflammatory miseries. Cold nights made joints throb. Old injuries spoke up. Backs protested the wagon boards with renewed eloquence. For older emigrants especially, or those worn thin by months of travel, the night could feel less like rest than like being stored badly. Humans, it turns out, are not ideal cargo. The sick person takes a little water at last. You can hear the swallow, then a low thanks nearly lost in the bedding. No one answers with anything dramatic. There is no strength for speeches. Only another blanket tugged higher, another hand on the shoulder. The wagon settles by degrees. The crisis, if it was a crisis, passes into management. Outside, one of the animals breathes against the cold. Farther away, a dog barks once. The ordinary night resumes, but now the wagon feels altered. You are aware in a deeper way of how thin the line is between inconvenience and danger. All evening the cold has been miserable. With sickness beside you it becomes consequential. A telling thread in emigrant letters is how often bodily complaints were noted almost casually, as if weakness has to be described in passing, lest it become too frightening when looked at directly. Rather unwell, bad cough, feverish, laid by one day. Such phrases can hide terrible uncertainty. Out here, there was rarely room for elaborate collapse. The train moved unless it could not. People endured unless they failed. Language itself became stoic because circumstances demanded it. At last the cough reduces to occasional rough breaths. The helper lies back down, but not fully remaining tilted toward the sick person in case another fit begins. You can feel that alertness even in the dark. Sleep again has become conditional. Everyone is resting around the possibility of interruption, and that may be one of the most unsettling parts of a freezing night on the Oregon Trail. You're not merely cold in your own skin, you're cold inside a fragile community of bodies, any one of which may falter. The wagon is not a bedroom. It is a little emergency ward, a nursery, a storeroom, a waiting room, a chapel of small whispered hopes. When illness speaks up under the blankets, The whole space listens. So you lie there more awake than before, hearing the uneven breath of the person beside you, and understanding with painful clarity that morning will not simply bring light. It will bring judgment. Who can stand? Who can walk? Who can hold down food? Who can drive? Who must be lifted? Who will pretend to be stronger than they are? The cold keeps asking its patient question, and the sick have fewer answers to give. The coughing quiets, though it never vanishes entirely. It lingers in the wagon like a warning that has chosen to whisper instead of shout. You try to settle again, but your mind has gone travelling. That is the trouble with nights like this. Once sleep has been broken often. Enough memory and rumour slip into the empty places. Someone outside says a few words too softly to catch. Another voice answers. Then the camp returns to its low midnight breathing. Yet now under your blankets old stories begin to move. This is the hour when trail memory grows teeth. You have heard them before the tales passed between fires spoken while coffee boiled or harness was checked, or children pretended not to listen. A train caught in an early storm. A family forced to abandon furniture, then clothing, then hope. A man who slept too close to the edge of a riverbank and woke to disaster. A woman who rode out a fever for 3 days and kept going. A child who nearly froze because the bedding got wet in a crossing and never properly dried. Every wagon party seems to carry such stories west along with the flour and bacon. They function partly as warnings, partly as entertainment, and partly as a kind of grim companionship. If others have suffered before you, your own suffering feels less like a personal insult from the universe, and more like membership in a terrible club. The Oregon Trail was full of remembered danger, and not all of it arrived dramatically. People feared river crossings, accidents, disease storms, exhaustion and delays that pushed them too late in the season toward mountain snow. Timing mattered enormously. Emigrants who left too late from jumping off points such as Independence or St. Joseph risked reaching the Rockies or the Blue Mountains under worsening weather. That broad fact haunted many camps because no amount of courage could persuade snow to be reasonable. Lying there in the wagon, you begin to understand how those stories must have worked on the nerves. By daylight, caution can feel practical. At night, caution becomes imagination. A snapping twig is no longer merely a snapping twig. It joins all the remembered twigs from all the remembered bad outcomes. The cold makes everything more convincing. Your body, already uncomfortable, is easy to persuade. There is a murmur from farther off in camp. A name, perhaps. Then silence again. You picture another wagon like yours, another cluster of blankets, another tired person lying awake and thinking of some account heard weeks earlier near a crossing or a fort. Memory spreads socially out here. Fear does too. A curious little feature of emigrant storytelling was the way practical advice often travelled inside lurid anecdote. People did not simply say, "Do not crowd the riverbank or keep blankets dry." They told stories about those who failed, stories vivid enough to linger in the mind long after dull instruction had wandered off. It is a very human teaching method. Unfortunately, it also means that once the lights are out, your imagination has a full, illustrated manual of what might go wrong. You remember one tale in particular, perhaps heard 3 nights ago beside another fire. A wagon delayed by broken gear, then caught by bitter weather before reaching safer country. The details are uncertain now, as such details often are. Was it South Pass? Was it farther west? Did the oxen weaken first, or the children? The story had that half-polished quality common to repeated frontier narratives, part truth, part shaping all effective. The point was not the exact location. The point was the warning. Do not waste time. Do not trust a mild day. Do not assume tomorrow will be kinder than today. Writers of the period recorded such anxieties in letters and journals with varying degrees of restraint. Some brushed them aside in a line or two. Others dwelled on rumours of storms ahead, impassable roads, or trains overtaken by winter. There is no single agreement among historians about how accurate every camp rumour was, because overland gossip could travel faster than truth, and often dressed itself in extra drama along the way. Yet even exaggerated stories could shape real behaviour. Fear does not always require perfect information, it only requires plausibility. The wagon around you creaks softly as the temperature continues to drop. The canvas feels closer somehow. A draft touches your cheek and your mind instantly supplies all the possible futures in which this cold becomes worse. That is the irritating brilliance of a tired brain. It takes one sensation and builds a cathedral of unease. Outside the wind shifts, not much. Just enough to make the cover give a long faint rustle overhead. But suddenly you imagine weather advancing across the dark, the kind of weather old hands claim they can smell before it arrives. You think of frost thickening on the grass, of puddles turning hard of the morning water bucket carrying a skim of ice. You think of the stories of wagons waking white and rigid under a cruel dawn wheels, locked with chill fingers too numb to tie a strap properly. A smaller stranger tidbit also belongs to the emotional weather of the trail. Some emigrants carried almanacs and referred to them not only for dates and moon phases, but for a kind of moral orientation, as though the printed order of days might steady the chaos of travel. It is oddly touching. When the road keeps changing and rumour keeps multiplying a page that calmly insists this is Tuesday, or the moon is waning, can feel like civilization itself trying to hold your hand. No one in the wagon is speaking now, yet you sense that others are also less asleep than they pretend. A sleeper shifts too quickly. Someone sighs with waking consciousness hidden inside it. The person who'd been coughing breathes more evenly for the moment, though each rough inhale still reminds you of how thin the margin is. In such conditions, rumour and bodily discomfort become close allies. The stories you have heard do not remain stories. They lodge in your muscles. Scholars have long discussed how emigrant memory was shaped by retrospective storytelling, and whether later accounts exaggerated danger to heighten drama or justify suffering. But from inside this wagon, that question feels almost beside the point. What matters tonight is not whether every remembered tale is exact. What matters is that people believed enough of them to listen differently to the wind. You find yourself measuring the cold against those stories. This is bad, you think, but not that bad. Then a minute later another draft slips along your neck, and you think perhaps it is becoming that bad. The body keeps revising its opinion with every shiver. It is difficult to remain philosophical when your feet feel like two hostile objects attached to your legs by some administrative oversight. There is a deeper fear underneath the anecdotes too. Not only that weather might worsen, but that fatigue might make you equal to less than you hope. The stories are full of external danger, but tucked inside them is always the same private question. When the time comes, will we have enough left? Enough strength? Enough food, enough nerve, enough luck. A freezing wagon night is a small rehearsal for that larger doubt. Beyond the canvas, the animals shift again. A chain clicks, grass tears. Somewhere a dog gives a low, uncertain growl and then gives up on the matter. The night itself remains ordinary. No storm attacks, no sudden disaster announces itself. And still the stories work on you because ordinary nights are exactly where dread likes to sit. By now you know that sleeping through a freezing night on the Oregon Trail is never simply physical. It is social, bodily, emotional, and deeply haunted by prior telling. You lie on hard boards under a thin cover, and the whole archive of trail anxiety curls up beside you. Old storms, late starts, lost animals, frozen blankets, delays, fevers, every remembered misfortune making itself at home in the dark, and so the night grows colder not only in temperature but in imagination. You pull the blanket closer as if wool could block memory as well as wind, and wait for the next shallow drift towards sleep, knowing that the stories will be waiting there too. At some uncertain hour after the coughing has eased, and the remembered stories have worn themselves down into a dull background, unease, you wake into a different kind of night. Not louder, not warmer, merely brighter. Moonlight has found the wagon. It comes through the canvas in the faintest possible way, not as a beam, not as a lantern-like glow, but as a pale whitening that turns the curved cover above you into something almost luminous. The woven cloth seems thinner now, its texture barely visible ribs of the wagon bows showing as ghostly arcs overhead. The darkness inside has not vanished. It has simply softened at the edges enough for shapes to separate from one another. A rolled coat, a heap of blankets, the outline of another sleeper's shoulder. A child's loose hand lying open on the bedding fingers curled in toward warmth. For a moment you do not move. The beauty of it catches you off guard, and that feels slightly rude. The night has been so cramped, so hard, so actively disagreeable, and now suddenly it offers this hush, this silvered stillness, as if hoping you will forget the previous several hours of cold negotiations and bodily complaints. Nature has a real talent for presenting a gorgeous view while you're personally having a terrible time. You turn your head carefully and see where the wagon opening admits a faint spill of moonlight from outside. Beyond it, the prairie must be glowing. You can sense that before you fully see it. Frost is likely spread over the grass in a thin, brittle layer, catching whatever light the moon can spare. The ground, the wheel, the edges of tethered shapes outside all of them transformed from practical objects into quiet, pale forms. The world has not become kinder, only prettier. That too belongs to the overland experience. Travellers on the Oregon Trail often remarked on the vast beauty of the landscapes they crossed, from open plains to mountain passes to river valleys. The route could be exhausting, filthy, dangerous and monotonous all in the same week, yet still produce moments of arresting loveliness that slipped past complaint and lodged in memory. A moonlit frost on the prairie is one of those moments. It does not solve anything. It merely stands there cool and radiant while you ache. You shift an inch and feel the blanket rasp softly against your chin. The air above it is still cold enough to sting the inside of your nostrils. Your breath remains visible in the dimness, a faint little cloud, when you exhale toward the wagon side. On the inside edge of the canvas, near the opening, you think you can make out a thin glittering trace, where moisture has gathered and chilled. Not thick frost, perhaps, but the beginning of it. Breath and cold collaborating into decoration no one asked for. A more unusual frontier note comes to mind here. Some travellers and settlers in the broader West occasionally described frost patterns on canvas wagon covers or tent cloth in surprisingly affectionate terms, comparing them to lace feathers or silverwork. It is wonderfully human to describe inconvenient ice with the language of embroidery. If a thing is going to make you miserable, you may as well grant it a little beauty and claim some dignity in the bargain. Outside, the camp has gone into that deepest version of quiet where each remaining sound seems placed very far apart. An ox shifts, then nothing for a long stretch. Then a horse shakes itself one harness, giving a small bright jingle that hangs in the air like a dropped pin. Then silence again. The moonlight makes even noise seem whiter. You lift the blanket edge just enough to peer outward. Cold air slips in immediately, thin and sharp, as if it has been waiting for the invitation. The wheel rim stands pale against the dark. The grass beyond looks dusted, every blade edged in frost. One of the oxen is visible as a broad, dim shape with its back touched by silver. Its breath drifts out in little ghostly bursts. The animal lowers its head, lifts it again, patient and solemn under the moon, as if it has accepted hardship with far greater maturity than the rest of the camp. There is something almost insulting in how peaceful the scene appears from this angle. The same night that has numbed your feet and pressed your hip into a crate corner now lies across the prairie like polished metal. This is one of the strange emotional double lives of the trail. The suffering can be intimate while the scenery remains magnificent. You may be individually miserable inside something breathtaking. Writers of emigrant recollections often toggled between those two truths without resolving them. One line would note severe discomfort, poor bedding, or freezing temperatures. The next would admire stars, dawn-light mountain views, or moonlit plains with genuine wonder. Modern readers sometimes expect either romance or realism, as though the past must choose a single tone. But actual experience is rude enough to contain both. You can admire the moon while resenting it deeply. The child's hand near you twitches once in sleep. Someone farther down the wagon murmurs and then stills. You're briefly aware of all the faces around you, not by sight exactly, but by the softened presence of them in this silvered dimness. People stripped of daytime character. No chatter, no competence, no fussing over pots or wheels. Just sleeping forms under blankets, all their social roles reduced to breathing. A smaller scholarly disagreement hovers somewhere in the background of scenes like this. Some researchers emphasize the relentless hardship of the trail and warn against aestheticizing it, while others note that emigrants themselves often found genuine pleasure and meaning in natural beauty despite the strain. From inside this wagon, that dispute feels less like an academic contest and more like a mood you are living through. The beauty is real. The discomfort is real. Neither cancels the other. The moonlight also changes your sense of time. Deep dark suggests endlessness. Pale light suggests movement. You cannot tell whether dawn is near, but the night no longer feels closed shut. It has a seam in it now, a hint that the world will eventually turn again. You study the inside of the canvas for a while, noticing the tiny irregularities in its surface. The places where the cloth sags slightly, the darker marks from old weather, the stitched lines and tension points. This humble bit of wagon cover has carried dust, sun, rain, and now frost. It is not noble. It is worked. Yet in moonlight it takes on a strange delicacy, like something in a museum displayed under careful lamps, which if the wagon cover could speak, it would probably find hilarious. Beyond the opening, the prairie continues to glow in its cold, reserved way. You imagine every wagon in the train touched by the same whitening light, every canvas arch carrying the same soft gleam, every family inside suspended somewhere between exhaustion and dawn. It makes the whole migration feel quieter than the daytime ever allows, less like conquest, more like temporary shelter scattered across an enormous, indifferent land. You lower the blanket again and trap what little warmth remains beneath it. Instantly, the inside world becomes darker, closer, more bodily. Yet the moonlight has done its work. You know what is outside now. Frost on the grass, silver on the wheels, white breath from the oxen, a world transformed but not improved. And perhaps that is exactly what it felt like at such an hour. To wake cold and sore in a wagon that has not become any softer to look out upon a prairie made radiant by moonlight and frost, and to feel both wonder and annoyance in equal measure. The beauty does not erase the misery. The misery does not blind you to beauty. They lie together for a while like two travellers forced to share the same blanket until morning. You let the blanket fall back into place and the moonlit prairie disappears as if someone has gently closed a door. Inside the wagon, the dark returns to being close and shared. Yet something has shifted in your mind. Not improved exactly. The cold is still there, your shoulder is still unhappy, and your feet remain only loosely committed to the concept of warmth. But the silvered world outside has left a trace behind, and now the border between waking and sleeping begins to thin in a different way. This is the hour when thoughts stop behaving properly. You're not fully awake, you're not truly asleep. You're somewhere in between in that soft, troublesome region where memory, fear, folk belief, and bodily discomfort all begin borrowing one another's clothes. The wagon seems at once smaller and larger than before. Smaller because every person in it feels close enough to touch. Larger because shadows inside it now hold peculiar shapes, and every little sound seems to come from farther away than it should. The 19th century was not short on beliefs about signs, omens, dreams, and the thinness of night. Emigrants heading west carried more than bedding and bacon. They carried old sayings, inherited cautions, church teachings, folk remedies, private superstitions, and those family convictions that nobody can quite trace, but everyone feels reluctant to ignore. If a bird cried at the wrong hour, if a dream returned 3 nights running, if a dog refused to settle, if a child spoke strangely in sleep, someone somewhere might decide it meant something. A trail journey did not erase such habits of mind. If anything, uncertainty fed them. You feel this now in the way the wagon sounds begin to blur with your own half-dreams. A strap taps lightly somewhere near the sideboard. Instantly your mind turns it into footsteps. A sleeper sighs. For one floating second it becomes a whisper in your ear. The canvas gives a tiny shift overhead, and you imagine fingers brushing along the outside. Then reason returns late and unimpressed, and points out that it is only cloth, only wind, only another person's breathing. But reason has to keep doing this. It does not win once and retire, it has night duty. A particularly charming and slightly eerie detail from frontier belief is how often people treated dreams as messages worth at least discussing. Not everyone did, of course, but many did. Dream books circulated, family sayings survived. A dream of water, a dream of death, a dream of losing teeth, all could be interpreted by somebody's aunt with magnificent confidence. Human beings adore patterns, especially when crossing a continent in a wooden vehicle while underslept. You hover in that uneasy middle state and find old beliefs easier to understand than you might in daylight. It is not that you suddenly become convinced the moon has opinions. It is simply that the ordinary defences of the mind are worn thin. Fatigue loosens the strict borders between sensation and story. A cold hand against your sleeve feels for half a second like the touch of someone who is not there. The low groan of wagon wood becomes almost vocal. You're not frightened exactly, more permeable, from scattered recollections of emigrant life. It is clear that campfire stories and trail gossip often included supernatural hints, right alongside practical warnings. Haunted places, strange lights, unsettling dreams, providential escape signs taken seriously after the fact. It would be surprising if they had not. Put human beings under stress, under stars, under the pressure of distance and weather, and they will begin giving extra meaning to ordinary things. Modern people do it in airport lounges and hospitals. The frontier merely provided better scenery. Someone in the wagon murmurs in sleep. The words are indistinct, but the tone carries feeling. Complaint, maybe. Maybe grief. The sort of sound that reminds you every mind in here is travelling through its own private landscape, while the bodies lie packed together on the same boards. A child gives a little start and then settles. One of the adults breathes out sharply through the nose, perhaps waking from a dream they have already forgotten. There are superstitions attached to sleep itself, too. Sleeping with the head toward this direction or that. Covering mirrors in a room where someone is dying. Taking a dream seriously only if it comes before dawn. Never speaking too confidently of tomorrow. Those beliefs did not rule everyone, but traces of them travelled widely through Anglo-American culture and beyond. And even people who laughed at omens in the sunlight might think twice about them after midnight with frost on the wagon cover. The prairie outside remains very still yet in your not quite sleeping state. It begins to feel inhabited by possibilities, not visible figures, nothing so theatrical. Rather the sense that the dark beyond the canvas contains more than geography. Distances too large to understand. Histories older than your wagon train. Lives unseen. The Westers emigrants encountered It was not an empty stage awaiting their arrival, whatever later mythology preferred to claim. It was already full of land, weather, indigenous nations, animal paths, memory and meanings the newcomers only partly grasped. Lying here in the night, you feel some small humbling edge of that truth. You are not the centre of the darkness. You are merely inside it. That thought drifts into dream almost without permission. For a little while you're half back at the fire, half on the moonlit prairie, half in some older place you have never actually seen. The mind is wonderfully bad at fractions when tired. The wheel becomes a tree stump. The canvas becomes a church roof. The ox breathing outside becomes surf on a shore. Then your numb ear reminds you that you're in a wagon after all, and the whole vision dissolves. There has been discussion among scholars about how much we should read folk belief into frontier decisions, because practical necessity often outweighed whatever omens people privately cherished. Yet private belief and public action do not have to match perfectly to shape experience. A woman may keep driving west while still disliking a certain dream. A man may laugh at signs while quietly repeating a prayer against them. In the dark, especially skepticism and superstition can coexist quite comfortably under the same blanket. You think of the moonlit frost outside the coffing earlier, the remembered cautionary stories the children press close the endless miles ahead. No wonder the mind begins inventing symbols. Hardship wants narrative. It wants to mean something. If a freezing night is only a freezing night, then it's hard and random and dull in the most exhausting way. If it is a test, a warning, a sign, a refining fire, an omen, a providential lesson, then at least it belongs to a story. This perhaps is why people have always embroidered the night. Not because they are foolish, but because darkness asks for interpretation. The body lies still, and the mind, lacking better occupation, starts arranging the unseen into forms it can bear. At last you drift again, not deeply, but enough for images to soften. The wagon boards remain under you. The wool still scratches at your chin. Somewhere nearby a sleeper breathes in a steady faint whistle. Yet your thoughts have lost their hard outlines. Folk sayings, moonlight old warnings, and dream fragments mingle, until none can be entirely separated from the others, and that too is part of what it felt like to sleep through a freezing night on the Oregon Trail. Not merely to endure the cold, but to feel the mind loosen under it, to slip toward old beliefs and shapeless worries, to let the night become larger than the wagon, and stranger than the day would ever permit. You're still here under canvas, still cold, still waiting for dawn. But for these drifting minutes, the darkness has become crowded with meanings, and sleep arrives, wearing the faint borrowed costume of myth. The dreaminess thins, the wagon returns. First the boards under your side, then the stale, cool pocket of air beneath the blanket, then the faint ache in your knees, the one that feels less like pain than like a complaint submitted hours ago and still pending. You open your eyes into darkness that is no longer dramatic, no longer haunted, simply tired. That may be the deepest part of the night. Not fear, not wonder. Just a worn-out awareness that you're still here and still cold and still many miles from the end of anything. This is when the journey begins to feel expensive. Not expensive only in money, though it certainly was that. Wagons, animals, tools, food, clothing, spare parts, firearms, medicines, all of it costs something before a family ever rolled west. But a freezing night like this reveals the other bill more clearly. The payment made in privacy, energy, rest, dignity, patience, bodily ease, and all the quiet luxuries people do not usually count until they vanish. The Oregon Trail was in plain terms a migration of households. People did not just move themselves, they moved systems of daily life. Cooking, washing, chilled-rearing courtship, worship, mourning, repairing, bargaining, arguing, hoping. Every one of those ordinary human activities had to be dragged into new forms under rough conditions. The trail was not simply a road. It was a long process of stripping life down and asking which pieces could be rebuilt each evening and which had to be abandoned. You feel that now in the wagon's cramped logic. There is no true solitude, no proper bedroom, no place to sit privately with grief or irritation or homesickness. Even your discomfort is shared. Someone else's foot finds your blanket. Somebody's cough enters your breathing space. A child's forehead lands against your shoulder. In one sense, that closeness is a comfort. In another, it is a debt collected nightly. You give up being alone in order to survive together. That trade was familiar to many emigrants. Letters and recollections from the overland years often show how migration altered family dynamics, personal habits, and expectations of daily life. People who had known houses now lived in partial exposure. People who had owned furniture now slept among sacks and crates. People used to separate spheres of work and rest, found both blended into one relentless routine. The freezing wagon night makes all that visible in one harsh, compact form. You're in bed, technically, yet still in the middle of transport, storage, family management, and weather. A curious little note from emigrant culture belongs here as well. Some travellers brought books west, sometimes heavy ones, even when every pound mattered. Bibles, hymnals, school readers, Shakespeare almanacs, novels, recipe books, legal manuals. It seems almost unreasonable until you remember what such objects represented. Not weight, but continuity. A printed page from home. A voice that sounded like order. A reminder that the self existed before the trail and might still exist after it. That single volume tucked beside the flour sack was doing more emotional work than its cover ever advertised. You lie there and think of what this journey has already taken from people even before anyone reaches Oregon. Soft mattresses, walls that meet properly, dry shoes by the hearth, the right to be sick in peace, the right to wake and not immediately think of animals' water distance or whether a wheel rim has loosened. Even silence is different now. It is no longer restful emptiness. It is a watchful silence full of obligations. There is also the question of possession. In a wagon, almost everything you own is near enough to touch and yet never quite secure. A pot can crack, a blanket can get wet, a bag can spill, a keepsake can disappear in mud. You start to understand that property on the trail is not about ownership in the abstract. It is about fragility. What can survive another creek crossing another cold snap, another careless hand in the dark? Commentators looking back on westward migration have sometimes emphasized opportunity so strongly that the daily attrition disappears behind it. Yes, people were heading toward land employment, kin religious hope, gold, or reinvention. But between origin and destination lay a brutal ledger of wear. Clothes thinned, tempers shortened, bodies aged. Hopes had to be patched like elbows in a coat. The triumphal version of the story often undercounts how much was spent merely to remain moving. And then there is intimacy altered by necessity. A freezing night in a covered wagon redraws the boundaries of the self. You cannot maintain much formality when sleeping beside tools, children, illness, and other adults under one tight curved roof. Affection becomes practical. Irritation becomes dangerous if indulged too far. Courtesy shrinks to the essentials. Here, take the blanket edge. Turn your shoulder, mind the cup, hold the child, wake me if the cough worsens. It is not the language of romance, yet it may be a tougher and more useful cousin. Some researchers have explored whether overland migration strengthened family bonds or merely exposed existing fractures more clearly. The evidence points both ways, which is perhaps the most human answer. Shared hardship can deepen loyalty. It can also magnify selfishness, resentment, and incompatibility. A freezing wagon night is not a moral purifier. It does not magically turn everyone into saints. It simply removes padding. What remains is whatever patience, tenderness, humour, pettiness, or endurance people actually possess when stripped of comfort. You discover too that the body keeps its own account books. Every lost hour of sleep, every stiff joint, every mile walked beside the wagon instead of riding, every meal eaten too fast or too cold. The body remembers the cost even when the mind wants to speak grandly of destiny. That is one reason dawn can feel strangely expensive after a bad night. Morning does not erase anything. It merely sends the bill forward into the day. Outside, the camp remains quiet in that thin, fragile way that suggests nobody is fully rested, only temporarily motionless. An animal tears at the grass. Farther off, a muted cough rises and fades. The air under the blanket smells of wool, breath-faint smoke, and the persistent human scent of effort. Your own hands tucked close have finally warmed a little, but your feet remain sceptical of recovery. A revealing fact from emigrant diaries is how often people kept moving through astonishing levels of fatigue simply because stopping posed its own risks. Delays could be dangerous. Supplies dwindled. Seasons changed. The logic of the trail rewarded continuation, not comfort. So a night like this was not merely endured for its own sake. It was endured because the wagon had to roll again. That larger purpose gave the suffering shape, but not relief. By now you know the night is doing more than making you cold. It is teaching the terms of migration. This is what westward movement asks. Not only hope, but subtraction. Not only courage, but compression. Not only ambition, but surrender of softness. A house becomes a wagon. A room becomes a blanket width. Rest becomes maintenance. Love becomes labour. Possessions become burdens unless they can justify themselves quickly. And perhaps that is the quiet revelation of these late hours. The Oregon Trail is often remembered in maps and milestones, forts and rivers, departures and arrivals. But its deepest meaning may have lived in nights like this one when the body lay still long enough to feel exactly what the journey was costing. Not in a grand tragic flash. In increments. Warmth. Space. Sleep, certainty. All paid out slowly under canvas while the prairie waited for dawn. You shift slightly, careful not to disturb the others, and listen to the wagon breathe around you. It feels suddenly less like a vehicle and more like an account ledger made of wood and cloth. Each cold hour another line entered. Yet you remain here. Everyone does. Because the cost, however steep, has already been accepted in advance by the simple fact of going on. At some point the night crosses from merely cold into that sharper, meaner stretch just before dawn, when whatever warmth the earth grudgingly offered has long since drained away, and the body seems to realise with fresh despair that morning is still not here. This is the cruelest hour, not because it is dramatic, but because it is so thoroughly used up. You have already spent your best sleep. You have already made your bargains with the blanket. Now even your optimism is running on fumes. You wake again, though wake is hardly the right word. You have not been deeply gone enough to return from anywhere interesting. You simply rise into discomfort once more like a person surfacing in dark water, only to discover the shore has moved farther away. The cold now feels cleaner and harder than it did earlier. It has shed any lingering softness from body heat and closeness. Your breath comes out in faint, pale wisps. The tip of your nose stings. Your toes, which spent the previous hours merely sulking, have entered open rebellion. Your lower back has stiffened into a shape that seems morally opposed to movement. Somewhere beneath the bedding, the wagon boards continue their patient mission of informing you that wood is not upholstery. This last portion of the night has a reputation for a reason. In cold weather, the hours just before sunrise are often the chilliest after the land, and ere have spent the whole night losing heat. On the trail, that fact was not a charming bit of meteorology. It was bodily knowledge. It meant that a person who had endured the evening and middle night tolerably well might still wake near dawn in a far worse condition of spirit than before. Timing as ever had opinions. Around you, the wagon has different mood now. The sleepers are heavier, duller, less fidgety perhaps, but also more vulnerable. Fatigue has sunk deep into everyone. The child who whimpered earlier is now limp with exhausted sleep, one hand still tangled in a blanket edge. The person who had coughed has gone quiet enough to make you listen for the next breath. Somewhere near your feet, someone shifts slowly and stops with the resigned care of a person who knows no better position exists. Outside, the camp is almost motionless. Even the animals seem subdued by this hour. An ox breathes out once long and tired. A horse gives a single stamp more from habit than alarm. Then nothing. The silence here is not empty. It is depleted. A silence after effort. A wonderfully practical little frontier habit belongs in this hour too. Some people slept with their boots, socks, or bits of clothing tucked under blankets, or even half under the body, not because this truly dried them in any luxurious sense, but because leaving them fully exposed to the night might make them stiff damp or bitterly cold to put on at dawn. It is one of those humble pieces of wisdom that sounds slightly ridiculous until you imagine trying to force frozen leather onto unwilling feet before breakfast. Suddenly, sleeping with your boots like treasured companions begins to seem almost elegant. You try not to think about getting up. That is the real terror now. Not dying on the prairie, not wolves, not dramatic catastrophe. Simply the unavoidable fact that at some point you will have to leave the blanket. You will have to put feet onto cold boards, find sleeves and shoes with numb fingers, and rejoin a world that is currently several degrees too interested in your suffering. This is where trail life becomes strangely heroic in the smallest possible terms. Great speeches about manifest destiny do not help you here. Grand ideas about the future do not lace your boots. What matters now is the ability to do the next miserable thing, move one hand, pull the blanket back a little, locate the coat, accept the cold, continue. Many emigrants rose before sunrise, often because the day's labour demanded it. Fires had to be revived or built, breakfast prepared, animals checked, fed, yoked or harnessed, bedding packed, wagons loaded, water fetched. A train that started late could lose precious miles. That plain historical fact gives this pre-dawn hour its edge. You are not suffering toward leisure. You are suffering toward more work. The temptation, of course, is to remain still and pretend. Pretend dawn will be delayed indefinitely. Pretend someone else will stir the fire. Pretend the oxen will harness themselves out of civic responsibility. Pretend that your feet, if ignored long enough, may become somebody else's administrative problem. The imagination can be very creative when the blanket is warm only by comparison. A more whimsical detail from emigrant recollections is how often people measured their mornings by coffee, not clock time. Before the drink, one sort of humanity, after it another. This makes perfect sense. A wagon train may not have had modern comforts, but it had the same deep civilizational understanding many people still possess. Hot coffee is not merely a beverage, it is an argument for remaining in society. You hear the first real sign that morning labour is approaching, a muffled movement outside, boots on stiff ground, someone up before the rest, or perhaps someone who never fully slept. There is a careful tread past the wagon, then the soft knock of something being lifted, maybe a bucket, maybe kindling, maybe yesterday's hope dragged reluctantly back into service. The sound is small, but it changes everything. The night is no longer just being endured. It is beginning to end. Yet ending is not relief, not immediately. Before dawn, the body's often at its weakest. Sleep debt heavy in the limbs. Warmth nearly gone. Patience thinned to transparency. A child may wake cross. Adults may speak more sharply than intended. Hands fail at easy tasks. Straps knot badly. Tin cups feel too cold to hold. One of the subtle trials of trail life is that the day often begins precisely when people are least fit for good temper. Observers of emigrant life have long noted that hardship did not arrive in occasional grand episodes alone. It lived in repetition, the same cold morning routine after a poor night, the same aching body asked to keep going, The same frayed nerves trying to remain decent inside close quarters. And perhaps that is why these pre-dawn minutes matter so much. They show endurance at its least glamorous. Not charging forward, just uncurling. You become aware now of the wagon's interior as a series of tasks waiting in darkness. The coat somewhere near your hip, the rolled blanket that must be folded later, the cup that must not be kicked over, the shoe half trapped beneath a sack, all of it still shapeless in the dimness, all of it about to become tomorrow's first set of inconveniences. The person who'd been coughing shifts and gives a rough but quieter breath. Good. The child near you snuffles once and burrows deeper into shared warmth. A woman somewhere in the wagon inhales sharply, waking into duty before she's had the chance to wake into herself. Another adult mutters something dry and half amused, the sort of remark people make when misery has become so familiar it may as well be greeted by name. And that is what this hour feels like above all. Familiar punishment. The night's final test delivered when everyone has already used up their best resistance. The cold is at its clearest. The body at its emptiest. The distance to dawn strangely both tiny and immense. Still outside another footstep. Another faint movement at the fire. The first person is up, and that means the rest of the camp will follow. Soon the blankets will be thrown back. Soon the cold will hit with full authority. Soon the day will begin. For one last moment, though, you remain under canvas in that bitter pause before sunrise, feeling the whole wagon hold its breath around you. This, perhaps more than any earlier discomfort, is what it felt like to sleep through a freezing night on the Oregon Trail. Not the first shiver, not the middle waking, but this thin, exhausted edge of morning when survival stops being passive and becomes active again, and even getting out from under the covers feels like a heroic mistake. The first person outside the wagon does not sound heroic. That may be the most believable part of it. No trumpet, no cheerful frontier hymn rising into the frost. Just the scrape of boots on hard ground, a muttered word swallowed by a scarf or collar, and the brittle noise of someone kneeling at last night's fire to see whether any life remains in the coals. You're still under the blankets, but the whole camp has shifted from endurance to motion. It is subtle at first. A stir farther down the wagon. Somebody drawing in a long, resigned breath. Cloth being pushed back. The tiny wooden complaint of weight moving toward the opening. Morning has not yet properly arrived in the sky, yet the labour of it has already begun. This is how the day starts on the trail, not with refreshment, with reclamation. The fire must be persuaded to live again if there's any chance of warmth before the wagons move. A few coals may still glow beneath the ash, hidden like grudges. If they do, someone crouches over them with that special mixture of hope and urgency known to all cold people in history. A breath, a twig, another breath, a handful of dry grass if there is any, a chip of fuel, then perhaps a little orange answer from below, small and miraculous. If not, everything begins from scratch, and morning becomes even more insulting. You hear the effort before you see it. The hollow little crackle of revived flame, a cough from smoke blown into the wrong face. Then the scent reaches you, slipping under the canvas in a thin, bitter ribbon. Ash char, dry grass, old grease, maybe a touch of buffalo chip if the camp is short on wood. It is not a fashionable aroma. It is the smell of civilization being rebuilt one spark at a time. For emigrants on the Oregon Trail, the morning fire was not a luxury. It was a practical centre of camp life. Heat for coffee, porridge, bacon, biscuits, or whatever rough breakfast could be managed. Warmth for numbed fingers. A place to thaw enough emotion back into the face to speak without sounding personally betrayed by the climate. Fuel mattered, and where timber was scarce, people improvised with brushroot, sage, and dried dung because hunger and frost do not permit aesthetic standards. Inside the wagon, you are still bargaining with the blanket. The part of you nearest the opening understands that the day has begun. The rest of you insists that nothing important should happen until the air becomes less cruel. Unfortunately, the trail is not administered by your preferences. A voice outside says something low. Another answers with the groggy irritation of someone who has just discovered how cold a tin bucket can feel before dawn. Then comes the splash of water being poured or shifted. Perhaps yesterday's water has skinned over with ice at the edges. Perhaps the cook pot is being rinsed in a style best described as symbolically clean. Nobody here is aiming for restaurant inspection standards. The wilderness offers many opportunities for humility, and dish sanitation is among them. A particularly telling frontier habit appears in these first minutes of day. People often saved live coals, banked fire carefully, or carried embers when they could, because making fire fresh in cold wind and weak light is a miserable way to start the morning. This sounds obvious now, but out here a living coal could feel as valuable as good news. The difference between a quick rekindling and a dead hearth might mean hot coffee in minutes or numb despair for half an hour. At last, delaying is pointless. You push the blanket back a few inches. Cold strikes immediately clean and direct. It gets inside the collar into the sleeves under the chin. You pause there halfway exposed, stunned once more by how personally offensive morning air can be after a freezing night. Then your feet touch the boards and you regret most of your previous life choices in a single, concentrated instant. The wood is like stone. Your boots, when you find them, are stiff and unwelcoming, though at least not entirely frozen. You drag them on with the graceless dedication of someone dressing for battle against weather rather than people. Around you, others are doing the same. A child whimpers. An adult says, "Come along now," in a tone balanced delicately between kindness and the recognition that time is moving regardless. You duck out of the wagon and the world hits you whole. The sky's not yet bright, only pale at one edge, the horizon beginning to loosen from black into iron grey. Frost lies over the grass in a thin sparkling crust. The wagons stand white-breathed, and still canvas covers touched with damp chill. The oxen are hulking shadows with silver on their backs. Every exhale from every living creature shows itself briefly and vanishes. The cold has sharpened all outlines. Wheels, ropes, buckets, boots, hands. Everything looks cleaner than it feels. You go straight to the fire because everyone goes straight to the fire. The human hierarchy reorganizes itself around heat. Whoever got up first has the moral authority of a saint. Whoever is blocking the warmth too effectively becomes, if only briefly, a public enemy. Hands extend toward the flames in silence. Palms first, then backs of fingers, then mugs if coffee is already being imagined into existence. Coffee, when it comes, is not a beverage so much as an event. The smell alone changes the camp. Dark, bitter, smoky, promising. Some wagon travellers started the day with coffee and simple fare almost by reflex because it was quick warming and emotionally indispensable. There are entire chapters of American migration that might better be understood as people hauling themselves west one tin cup at a time. A stranger little nugget from overland life belongs here too. Some emigrants complained bitterly in diaries when coffee ran low, as if the collapse of civilization itself could not be far behind. This is funny, but only because it is true in spirit. Sleep badly, wake frozen, stand in the dawn beside a wagon full of responsibilities, and suddenly roasted beans acquire the gravity of a religious sacrament. Breakfast begins in fragments. Someone stirs mush. Someone fries a little salt pork. Someone cuts bread that has gone hard at the edges. Children are coaxed upright and wrapped tighter. The coughing person from the night emerges more slowly, face pale in the dawn, but upright, which everyone notices without quite saying so. That quiet noticing is one of the most human acts in camp. Who is standing? Who is not? Who can hold a cup steadily? Who is pretending well enough to continue? There is no leisurely recovery. Even the warmth of the fire comes with instructions attached. While your hands thaw, your eyes are already scanning the camp for the next tasks. Bedding will need shaking and folding. Ashes judged. Animals fed, checked and yoked. The wagon repacked. A child's stockings found, a rope retied. The day opens like a list. Some interpreters of trail life have pointed out that morning labour exposed the real strength of a wagon party more clearly than any grand crisis. Not how people behaved in a dramatic emergency, but how they functioned after poor sleep, aching backs and bitter cold. Could they still cooperate? Could they still move? Could they still keep small irritations from becoming larger failures? The trail loved testing groups in exactly that unromantic way. You warm your hands over the fire and feel sensation return with those little painful pins that are somehow both unpleasant and glorious. Smoke drifts across your face, your eyes sting. The coffee is hot enough to make your lips smart and wonderful enough that you do not care. Nearby someone laughs softly at nothing much simply from relief that the fire caught, and morning, however cruel, has at least chosen to proceed, and that may be the truest feeling of this hour, not triumph, not comfort, relief mixed with obligation. You have made it through the night, yes, but the reward for surviving a freezing wagon sleep is immediate employment. Fire again, water again, animals again. Breakfast if possible, motion soon after. So you stand in the brittle dawn with smoke in your clothes and warmth creeping slowly back into your fingers, watching the camp rebuild itself from ash, frost and human stubbornness. The night has not been erased. It lingers in your stiff joints and gritty eyes. But flame is alive, coffee is near, and the day, rude as it is, has begun to answer back. The fire has done what it can, which is not nothing. Your fingers bend again. Your face no longer feels carved from wood. The coffee, thin or strong depending on luck and supply, has passed through you like a vote in favour of continuing civilization for one more day. Yet warmth at a morning campfire is a temporary loan, never a gift. The moment you step away from it, the air reminds you who truly governs the plains. And now comes the awkward necessary business of turning a night's shelter back into a day's machine. The blankets must be shaken out first. That sounds simple until you're doing it with stiff wrists in frost-crusted air. You carry the bedding from the wagon and snap it hard, sending out a pale cloud of dust-loose straw, a few threads, and the faint lingering smell of sleep. Smoke, wool breath, cold canvas, human effort. The whole night rises from the fabric and drifts away in the morning light. What remains still looks tired. There is frost on some of it, just a little along the edges where damp breath and cold met in the dark. You brush it off with your hand and feel the crystals melt against your skin. The quilts are heavier than they ought to be holding the night inside them. Featherbeds, if anyone is lucky enough to have one left in decent shape, must be aired briefly without letting them drink in too much more chill. Buffalo robes get beaten, coats are turned, shawls are checked for damp patches. Nothing can simply be thrown back inside the wagon if it has become wet. Wet things on the trail do not quietly improve. They become tomorrow's misery with a schedule. This constant handling of bedding and clothing was part of the ordinary routine for many emigrants, especially in poor weather or cold conditions. The wagon could shelter people for the night, but it also trapped moisture, dust, and the general residue of close human life. Morning meant resetting all of that as best one could. One more example of how the trail transformed rest into work, and work into the price of having rested at all. You climb back into the wagon to begin the rearranging. The interior looks even smaller by daylight. That seems unfair, but there it is. In darkness it had at least possessed mystery. In morning light it is plainly a wagon bed crowded with crates, sacks, tools, cooking things, clothing bundles, and the wrinkled aftermath of a family night. The rough boards that bruised your sleep now demand order. A pot gets wedged more securely. A rolled blanket becomes padding between two hard boxes. A sack of flour is shifted away from the wheel well. Someone searches for a missing mitten, with a desperation that suggests it may currently be the most valuable object in North America. A child is told to lift, then to move, then to stop standing in precisely that place. The child ignores all three instructions with the serene confidence of the very young. One delightful and completely believable detail from emigrant recollections is how often people mislaid small, crucial items in the morning chaos. Tin cups, buttons, thimbles, knives, combs, straps, socks, prayer books, spoons, bits of harness all swallowed by blankets and boxes with suspicious efficiency. The covered wagon was not a tidy chest of drawers. It was a mobile argument against easy retrieval. If you dropped something into the wrong corner at dawn, you might not see it again until Wyoming. Outside, the animals had been made ready too, and their preparation runs beside yours like a second clock. Oxen are brought in from grazing yoked pair by pair, each broad neck, fitted under wood polished by use. Mules toss their heads. Horses stamp and breathe steam. Harness leather creaks in the cold. A man tests a strap with fingers that still do not fully trust themselves. Another checks a wheel and then checks it again, because yesterday's road taught him humility. There is a stern practical truth in this. A wagon train moved only as quickly as its animals' gear and people could be made ready each morning. Delays did not always come from dramatic catastrophe. More often they came from small accumulations, a tangled trace chain, a missing bucket, a child with a fever, a mule with ideas, a cold, stiff hand failing at a knot that would have been easy in a kitchen back home. The morning after a freezing night is full of such little thefts of time. You shake out one last blanket and think of the night that lived in it only an hour ago. The elbow in your ribs, the coughing, the moonlight on the canvas, the long bitter stretch before dawn. Already it's becoming folded memory compressed into fabric and routine. That may be one of the strangest parts of trail life. A miserable night can be transformed into a packed bundle by breakfast, because there is simply no room to keep living inside it. Some historians have wondered how much emigrants normalize discomfort in their own minds just to keep going. The evidence suggests quite a lot. Not because they enjoyed hardship, but because they could not afford to treat each bad night as a unique tragedy. To survive overland travel, one had to downgrade misery into procedure. Shake out the frost, fold the quilt, repin the shawl, move on. There is also the matter of appearances. Once the bedding is packed, the wagon must look prepared even if nobody inside feels remotely ready. Covers are checked, lashings tightened. The whole little household is tied down again against ruts, jolts, and miles. It is astonishing how quickly a place of intimate nighttime existence can become cargo space once more. A sleeping corner becomes a stack of goods. A family room becomes transport. A cradle becomes a box. Morning on the trail is an exercise in turning private life back into freight. A smaller social drama plays out around the fire. Breakfast things are cleaned or at least persuaded into acceptability. A child who does not want to put on cold stockings is coaxed or bribed. Someone complains softly about a sore back. Someone else pretends not to hear because sympathy would consume valuable minutes. The person who coughed during the night is walking slowly but walking wrapped high in a blanket or coat, and that alone shifts the mood of the camp toward gratitude. The sky now is brighter pale gold beginning at the rim of the world. Frost flashes on the grass where the sun touches it first. Wagon tongues cast long thin shadows. The prairie looks almost innocent in this light, which is outrageous considering what it allowed your spine to experience a few hours ago. Beauty remains one of the landscape's more irritating habits. There were of course schedules of a sort on the trail, though not the clock-ruled schedules of factories or trains in the eastern states. People measured departure by light animals, whether river crossings ahead, and the general condition of the party. Still, there was real pressure to get moving. In peak migration years, the road west became a flowing season of wagons, and every day of progress mattered. A late start repeated too often could become a serious concern by the time harder country and harsher weather arrived. So at last the bedding is packed, the crates wedged, the cups stowed, the children accounted for the tools back in reach. You give the wagon one more look, not because it is perfect, but because perfection has no place here. It is ready enough. On the trail, ready enough is a sacred phrase. Then comes the signal in all but name. The stock leans into place, the drivers call. Wheels groan faintly as they take weight. A last breath of fire warmth leaves your coat as you step away. The wagon that held your freezing night is now merely the wagon again, another rolling box in a line pointed west. And you understand perhaps more clearly than before that no one gets to linger over a bad night on the Oregon Trail. There is no long recovery, no indulgent morning in bed, no thoughtful pause to discuss feelings while wrapped in a warmed robe. There is frost to brush off bedding, to pack straps to tie, and miles that will not travel themselves. The night is folded up with the quilts and carried onward, not resolved, only stored. The wagon lurches forward, with the same lack of ceremony it had when it stopped the evening before. No one announces that a night has been survived. The wheels begin to turn, the teams lean into the traces, and the whole camp stretches itself back into a moving line, as though sleep, however broken, has fulfilled its duty and can now be dismissed without further discussion. You walk beside the wagon at first, because many people do. Riding space is limited and the animals are carrying enough already. The cold morning air works into your lungs with a dry metallic sharpness. The frost on the grass breaks under boots and wheels with a brittle whispering crunch. Behind you the campsite is already becoming ordinary ground, again trampled earth, ash, dung, wheel. Marks a few darker patches where the fire sat and the water spilled, and the night briefly built itself into a human settlement before dissolving at dawn. That vanishing is part of what stays with you. A freezing night in a covered wagon does not leave grand visible ruins. It leaves stiffness in the back, rawness in the throat, a smoky smell in the blankets, a child more clingy than yesterday, an adult more quiet than usual, a slight drag in the pace at breakfast, a deeper gratitude for coffee, a sharper appreciation for any patch of sunlight later in the day. It leaves itself in the body. The prairie does not record it for you. You carry the record onward in your joints. This is one of the most useful truths about emigrant travel. The great westward journeys were not shaped only by rivers, crossed mountain passes, climbed, and destinations reached. They were also shaped by nights of poor rest, damp bedding, coughing cramped quarters, frost-bitten mornings, and the cumulative strain of keeping a household moving while never fully restored. The big story is made of small attritions. You feel them all now as you walk. The bruised place on your hip where the crate corner found you. The soreness in your neck from using a coat as a pillow. The grainy heaviness behind the eyes from sleep cut into pieces. Even your mood has a texture to it, worn but steadier now that movement has resumed. The trail often gave people that strange gift. Once the wagon rolled again, discomfort became less theatrical. There was something to do, something to watch, a rhythm to fall into. The children show the difference first. One who was miserable under the blankets last night is brighter after food and motion, pointing at something in the grass, as though the whole difficult world has been forgiven because a bird happened to rise from the frost. Childhood can be very rude to adult theories of suffering that way. Another child rides for a while in the wagon wrapped in shawls, blinking solemnly as if still negotiating terms with the morning. The person who coughed in the night is still with the train and upright, though pale. Everyone notices without lingering on it. On the trail, relief is often quiet. A cup offered, a place made easier, a glance that checks whether someone is keeping up. People learned quickly that survival did not always arrive as triumph. Sometimes it arrived merely as continued participation. There is a quietly funny detail in many overland recollections, and it fits here perfectly. People often became passionately grateful for absurdly modest improvements. A less lumpy stretch of ground, a ford that was only knee-deep, a day without headwind, a biscuit not burned black. The bar for joy could drop remarkably low and still remain entirely sincere. After a freezing wagon night, a little sun on the side of your face can feel like a personal reconciliation with the universe. The road, if it deserves that polished word, stretches on ahead in pale ruts. Wheels settle into old tracks where countless others passed before. The Oregon Trail was not a single untouched line through wilderness, so much as a broad network of routes, cutoffs, campgrounds, ferries, riverbanks, and worn places where repetition itself shaped the land. That matters because it reminds you that your miserable night was never singular. Others slept badly here before you. Others woke to frost-packed, damp quilts and kept walking. The route west was made not just by wagons, but by accumulated endurance. Yet even knowing that does not make the experience generic. The night remains intensely personal in memory. You remember the child's hand catching your blanket, the moonlight whitening the canvas, the ox breathing outside, the rough cough in the dark, the meanest hour before dawn when getting out from under the covers felt like an act of betrayal against your own body. These particulars are what the memory keeps. History at its calmest and deepest is often made of such particulars. Writers and interpreters have never entirely settled the question of how emigrants balance suffering against hope in their recollections. Some later accounts lean toward gratitude, framing the hardships as the necessary toll on a meaningful journey. Others preserve irritation more honestly, and perhaps both are true because memory itself softens some edges while sharpening others. You may forget exactly how cold your feet were. You do not forget what it felt like to realize the wagon was both shelter and insufficiency at once. As the morning grows older, light spreads over the plain and begins loosening frost from the grass. The wheels make a duller sound now. Leather warms slightly. Faces emerge from collars and bonnets. Someone starts humming for a little while, not loudly, just enough to be heard by the nearest few. The campfire smoke smell remains in your clothes. The sleep debt remains in your bones. But life has shifted from endurance to progress, and that distinction matters. The social world of the wagon train resumes its daytime form. Instructions, small jokes, a warning to mind the wheel, a request for water, an argument about whether the road ahead looks better to the left or the right, a child asking impossible questions, a woman retying a bundle while walking, a man adjusting a trace chain with the expression of somebody who would like the chain to appreciate how much has already been asked of him this week. The freezing night has not vanished, but it has been absorbed into the ongoing choreography of migration. That absorption may be the most revealing part of all. The Oregon Trail did not allow much separate space for private suffering. Discomfort had to be folded into action, fear into routine, memory into motion. A bad night could shape the day without halting it. It could make people quieter, shorter-tempered, more tender, more irritable, more protective, more grateful for small warmths. But unless it turned into illness or breakdown, the train rolled on. In that sense, the trail taught a severe kind of emotional economy. Feel what you feel, then yoke the oxen. A charmingly specific relic of emigrant memory appears in the way people later described ordinary camp comforts with almost reverent detail. A dry blanket, a sheltered hollow, a kettle that did not leak, a bit of bacon at dawn, a patch of level ground. Those tiny items recur in journals and recollections because they mattered disproportionately. Hardship rearranges value. A thing does not have to be grand to become beloved. It only has to relieve misery at the right moment. By midday, perhaps the worst stiffness will ease. The sun will soften the air. The wagon that felt like a coffin of boards and canvas in the coldest hour may become once again merely a burdened vehicle creaking west through dust. But the night will stay with you in subtler ways. You will check tonight's campsite more carefully. You will think differently about damp bedding. You will notice which child coughs at sundown and which adult grows too quiet near the fire. The night becomes instruction, and that finally is what it felt like to sleep through a freezing night inside a covered wagon on the Oregon Trail. Not a single emotion, but a braid of many. Cold in the nose and toes, hardness under the hip, the breath of animals outside, The damp chill under canvas, the closeness of family, the hidden labour of women, the weary pride of men, sick lungs in the dark, children seeking warmth by instinct, moonlight on frost, fear made from stories, dawn earned in sparks and coffee. Then the folding up of it all, the packing away, the moving on. You do not conquer such a night, you outlast it. And when the wagon rolls forward into the pale widening day, you carry more than your bundle and your fatigue. You carry the peculiar intimacy of shared discomfort, the knowledge that survival on the trail is built from countless unglamorous acts, and the strange quiet wonder of having remained human inside so much cold. The road stretches west. The wheels keep turning. The prairie opens ahead in long patient lines. Behind you the night has already become memory. Around you morning grows gentler by degrees, and within you the lesson of that freezing sleep settles softly into place, not as a heroic tale, but as something truer and smaller and perhaps more lasting. A hard night survived in company. A little warmth borrowed and passed along. A home made briefly under canvas, then folded and carried onward. Now the pace slows. The road smooths in your mind. The sunlight grows milder, less glaring, more golden, as if the day itself is laying a softer blanket across the land. You no longer feel each wheel jolt so sharply. The sounds of harness and hoof and quiet voices begin to drift farther apart, gentler now, like things heard from the edge of sleep rather than from within labour. The prairie that seemed so wide and stern in darkness opens into something calmer, almost tender in its distance. You let the wagon move on without needing to follow every creak. You let the cold of the night loosen its grip. The boards, the cough, the frost, the bitter hour before dawn, they all recede a little, not erased, only softened by light and time. Around you the trail continues as it always does, but in your thoughts it becomes quieter. The oxen breathe, the wheels turn. A child somewhere is warm enough now to stop complaining. Someone lifts a cup to the morning sun. Someone else pulls a shawl a little tighter and smiles without meaning to. And you can rest here for a moment in the simple fact that the night passed. That is all. No grand victory required. No speech, only the small, deep comfort of knowing that cold does not last forever, that dawn comes even to canvas shelters, that human beings have always found ways to share warmth when warmth was scarce. You were crowded, chilled, cramped and tired. You were also carried in tiny ways by the nearness of others, by the breathing of animals, by the glow of coals, by the rhythm of a wagon train that refused to stop being a community simply because the night was hard. So now as the prairie light softens and the miles grow dreamlike, you let the image settle gently. A covered wagon under frost, a pale moon on canvas, a fire coaxed back from ash, blankets folded, wheels rolling west. Nothing rushed, nothing sharp. Only the quiet after endurance, the hush after cold, the feeling of a long hard night drifting backward into memory like breath fading into morning air. And with that the road grows stiller in your mind, the sky wider, the voices softer, until everything is held in one calm final picture. A little wagon moving through a waking world, and you at last warm enough to let go. Sweet dreams!